Tonight, I will share with you 15 jewels of ancient wisdom, stories that have traveled through centuries from mountain monasteries and moonlit gardens, each one a gentle doorway into peace. These are not tales to grasp or remember, but whispers to dissolve the day's weight and guide you softly toward the threshold of sleep. Let yourself sink a little deeper into comfort as we begin, feeling the softness beneath you, the gentle rhythm of breath moving through your body like a quiet tide. Our first story takes us to Japan during the Meiji era, when the old ways were meeting the new, when temples stood beside universities, and ancient wisdom sat across the table from modern certainty. In those days, there lived a Zen master named Nan, whose name meant difficult to enter, though his presence was as welcoming as afternoon sunlight filtering through paper screens. He lived simply in a small temple on the edge of a bustling city, where the sounds of progress and industry mingled with the temple bells that had rung for 300 years. One autumn afternoon, when the maple leaves were beginning their slow surrender to gold and crimson, a university professor came to visit Nan. This professor was a man of considerable reputation, his mind filled with theories and philosophies gathered from books written in 5 languages. He had read everything that could be read about Buddhism, about meditation, about the nature of consciousness and the path to enlightenment. He could quote from texts that most monks had never seen, could trace lineages back through centuries, could debate the finest points of doctrine with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. He arrived at Nan's temple in the late afternoon, his leather briefcase heavy with papers, his mind even heavier with questions he had prepared. The autumn sun was beginning its descent, painting the temple walls with warm amber light, and somewhere in the garden a single cricket had begun its evening song. Nan greeted him at the entrance with a bow, his movements unhurried, his smile gentle as he gestured for the professor to remove his shoes and enter. They sat in a simple room with tatami mats that still held the faint scent of fresh grass, facing each other across a low wooden table worn smooth by countless such meetings. The professor immediately began to speak, his words tumbling forth like water breaking through a dam. He spoke of his studies, of the various schools of Buddhist thought he had examined, of the contradictions he had found between different texts, of his theories about consciousness and emptiness. His hands moved as he talked, punctuating his arguments, and his eyes gleamed with the particular intensity of someone who has spent years building elaborate structures of thought. Nan listened, saying nothing, his face serene as a still pond. After some time, when the professor paused to draw breath, the master spoke softly. "Would you care for some tea?" The professor, slightly taken aback by this interruption of his intellectual discourse, nodded. Yes, of course, tea would be fine. And as I was saying about the distinction between gradual and sudden enlightenment, Nan rose with the fluid grace of someone who has performed this simple action 10,000 times, each time as if for the first time. He went to the corner of the room where a small iron kettle sat on a brazier, steam rising from its spout in delicate wisps that caught the slanting afternoon light. He returned with the kettle in one hand and 2 simple clay cups in the other, their glaze the color of river stones. The professor continued talking, barely noticing, as Nan placed a cup before him and began to pour. The tea was green and fragrant, carrying the scent of mountain mists in early spring. It filled the cup slowly, the sound of the pouring a gentle counterpoint to the professor's voice. The cup filled to the brim, and still the professor talked, gesturing now with one hand while the other rested on his knee. And still Nan poured. The tea reached the lip of the cup and began to overflow, spilling onto the wooden table in a spreading pool, running toward the edge where it would drip onto the pristine tatami mat below. The professor stopped mid-sentence, his attention finally caught by this strange action. "Master, excuse me, but the cup, it's full, can't you see? No more will go in. The tea is spilling everywhere. You must stop pouring." Nan continued pouring for just a moment longer, then gently set down the kettle. He looked at the professor with eyes that were neither stern nor mocking, but filled with a kindness that somehow made what he said next land more deeply than any criticism could have. "Like this cup," he said quietly, "you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" The room fell silent, except for the sound of tea dripping onto the floor. a slow, rhythmic sound like a water clock marking moments. The professor sat frozen, staring at the overflowing cup, at the pool of tea spreading across the table, and something in his chest began to crack open, like ice at the first touch of spring. All his knowledge, all his theories, all the carefully constructed arguments he had brought with him. Suddenly they felt like the tea spilling wastefully onto the floor, beautiful perhaps, but serving no purpose because there was nowhere for them to go. "You have travelled far to come here," Nan continued, his voice soft as the rustling of the maple leaves outside the window. "Your learning is vast, like an ocean. But learning and understanding are not the same thing. A cup that is already full cannot receive. A mind that knows all the answers has forgotten how to ask the real questions." The professor felt tears beginning to form at the corners of his eyes, though he could not have said exactly why. Perhaps it was the kindness in the master's voice, or perhaps it was the sudden recognition of how much energy he had spent these many years filling his cup, adding more and more, never pausing to taste what was already there, never considering that the cup might need to be emptied before it could be truly filled. "Tell me," Nan said, leaning forward slightly, "when you drink tea, really drink it, do you think about all the knowledge you have of tea? Do you consider the chemistry of the leaves, the temperature of the water, the history of tea cultivation in China, or do you simply taste the tea?" The professor opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. In truth, when was the last time he had simply tasted anything? Every meal was accompanied by conversation or reading. Every moment was filled with analysis, with comparison, with the endless churning of thought upon thought upon thought. Nan picked up the other cup, the one he had poured for himself, and took a slow sip. He closed his eyes briefly, and a slight smile crossed his face. "This," he said, "is just tea. Green tea, picked from bushes that grow on the hillside behind this temple, dried by the afternoon sun, steeped in water, heated to the right temperature. Nothing more, nothing less. When I drink it, I am just drinking tea. I am not drinking my knowledge of tea. I am not drinking my opinions about tea. I am drinking tea." He set down the cup and looked at the professor with such direct simplicity that it was like being seen for the first time. "You have come here seeking something, but you are so busy carrying what you already have that you cannot receive anything new. This is not wrong, you understand. It is simply the nature of a full cup. But if you wish to learn about Zen, you must first learn about emptiness. Not the emptiness you have read about in books, the emptiness you experience when you set down what you are carrying." The professor sat very still, and in that stillness something shifted. He became aware of the weight he had been carrying, not just in his briefcase, but in his mind, in his chest, in the tightness of his shoulders. Years of accumulation, of building, of defending his positions and polishing his arguments until they shone like armor. And what had all that weight brought him? Here he was, famous and respected, author of papers and books, sought after by students, and yet he had felt compelled to come to this simple temple, to sit before this simple master, seeking something he could not name but knew he lacked. "May I ask you something?" the professor said, his voice different now, quieter, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Of course," Nan replied. "How does one empty the cup?" Nan smiled, and this time his smile was like sunrise. "Ah," he said, "now you have asked a real question. Now there is space for an answer to enter. You see, it is already beginning." He gestured to the spilled tea on the table. "This cup overflowed because it was full, and I kept pouring. But notice, the tea that spilled is not ruined. It is simply on the table instead of in the cup. Your knowledge, your learning these things are not bad. They are like this tea, beautiful, valuable, the result of much care and effort. But when there is too much, when the cup cannot hold any more, something must spill over. The way to empty the cup is not to throw away what you have learned. That would be wasteful, like throwing away good tea. The way to empty the cup is to drink what is there, to take it in fully, to let it nourish you, and then to set the cup down empty, ready to be filled again. Each moment can be a fresh cup of tea, but only if you finish with the last cup, only if you are willing to let it be complete and move on." The professor nodded slowly, and as he did, he felt his shoulders drop, felt his jaw unclench. The Buddha taught, Nanin continued, that mind precedes all mental states, that mind is their chief, and they are all mind-wrought. What did he mean by this? Simply that what you think becomes what you experience. If your mind is full of certainty, you will experience a world that confirms your certainty. If your mind is full of questions, you will experience a world that asks you to question. And if your mind is empty, spacious, open like the sky, then you can experience the world as it actually is, moment by moment, fresh as morning dew on a spider's web. Outside the window, the sun had dropped lower, and the garden was filling with that particular quality of light that exists only at dusk, when day and night meet and merge. The cricket's song had been joined by others, creating a tapestry of sound that seemed both random and perfectly orchestrated. The professor became aware of these sounds as if hearing them for the first time, though they had been present all along. Nanin rose and fetched a cloth, wiping up the spilled tea with careful attention, wringing it out into a bowl. Even this simple action seemed to contain something worth noticing, the way his hands moved, the thorough care he took with each stroke of the cloth. When the table was clean, he poured fresh tea into both cups, filling them only halfway. "See," he said, "now there is room. Room for the tea to breathe, room for the aroma to rise, room for more to be added if needed. A cup half filled is more useful than a cup overfilled." They drank their tea together in silence, and this time the professor truly tasted it. The slight bitterness, the vegetal sweetness, the warmth spreading down his throat and into his chest. It was just tea, and it was everything. When the cup was empty, he felt no need to immediately speak or ask another question. The emptiness itself was enough. As the professor prepared to leave, bowing deeply to Nanin, the master walked him to the entrance. The evening star had appeared in the darkening sky, brilliant against the deep blue. Nanin paused at the doorway and spoke once more. "You will go back to your university, to your books and your lectures. This is good. These things have their place, but try this if you will. Each morning, before you begin your day, sit quietly for a few moments and imagine emptying your cup. Let yesterday's thoughts pour out. Let your expectations and plans pour out. Sit with the empty cup, just for a moment. Then rise and begin your day. See what pours in when you make space for it." The professor walked back through the streets as they filled with the soft glow of lanterns, and his footsteps felt lighter than they had in years. He still carried his briefcase, still possessed all his knowledge, but somehow the weight of it had changed. He thought of the overflowing cup, of the tea spilling onto the table, of Nanin's gentle question, "How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" And he realized that this question would stay with him, not as something to answer, but as something to live with, to return to again and again, each time finding the cup a little less full, a little more ready to receive. Perhaps you too have felt this fullness, this weight of carrying so much that nothing new can enter. The day's concerns stacked like dishes waiting to be washed. Worries about tomorrow poured on top of regrets about yesterday, until the cup of the mind overflows and spills everywhere, making a mess of the present moment. But here, now, in this quiet space between waking and sleep, you can set down the cup. You can let it be empty for a moment. You don't have to solve anything, understand anything, hold on to anything. Like the professor watching tea spill onto an ancient table, you can simply observe what it feels like when the cup is too full, and then you can choose, breath by breath, to pour a little out. To make space, to become empty enough to receive what this moment is offering, this peace, this stillness, this gentle descent into rest. And as we prepare to move to our next story, let the image of the overflowing cup remain with you, not as something to think about, but as a feeling in your body, a slight loosening in your chest, a softness in your belly, a recognition that you are allowed to be empty, allowed to not know, allowed tea. Oh, simply be a vessel that receives and releases, like breath itself, like the tide, like tea poured into a cup and then consumed, leaving the cup clean and ready, empty and full of possibility, here in this timeless moment that asks nothing of you but your presence. As we leave the temple where Nanin poured tea until it overflowed, let us journey now to a different path, a muddy road in ancient Japan where two monks are walking together through the countryside after days of rain. The story of the overflowing cup taught us about emptiness, about making space by releasing what we carry in our minds. This next tale asks us to look more closely at what we carry, and for how long, and whether the weight we bear is still necessary, or if we simply forgot to set it down. The two monks were named Tanzan and Ekido, and they could not have been more different in temperament. Tanzan moved through the world with a certain lightness, his steps unhurried, his eyes often catching on small things, a bird in flight, the way light fell through bamboo, the sound of water over stones. Ekido, by contrast, walked with purpose and precision, his mind constantly reviewing the rules and precepts of monastic life, ensuring that every action aligned with every teaching, that no breach of conduct occurred, no matter how small. Both men were devoted practitioners, both sincere in their seeking, but they walked the path in very different ways. It was late spring, and the roads throughout the province had become nearly impassable from weeks of heavy rain. The rivers had swollen beyond their banks, and even the smaller streams had become rushing torrents of muddy water, erasing the usual crossing points and creating new channels where none had been before. The two monks had been traveling from temple to temple, carrying messages and offerings, and now they were on their way home, eager to return before nightfall. As they approached a crossroads where a stream normally trickled across the road, they found instead a wide expanse of churning water and mud, perhaps 20 feet across, too deep to wade through without soaking their robes up to the waist. The current was strong enough that crossing would require careful balance, and one misstep might mean being swept downstream into the flooded rice paddies beyond. Standing at the edge of this muddy torrent was a young woman, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, dressed in an elegant silk kimono with embroidered cranes flying across a pale blue background. She held a small bundle to her chest and was staring at the water with an expression of complete dismay. Her wooden sandals were designed for dry weather, for walking through gardens and along clean temple paths. They would be worse than useless in this rushing water. They would slip off or cause her to fall. Tanzan and Ekido approached, and the young woman turned toward them with relief in her eyes. "Forgive me, honored monks," she said, bowing despite her distress. "I must cross to reach my grandmother's house on the other side. She is ill and expects me. But I cannot manage this water alone, and there has been no one on the road for over an hour. Might you help me find a way across?" Ekido stiffened immediately, his face becoming stern. He opened his mouth to refuse, to explain that monks were forbidden from having physical contact with women, that the rules were clear and existed for good reason, that she would simply have to wait for someone else to come along or find another route. But before he could speak, Tanzan stepped forward. "Of course," the older monk said simply. "Please allow me." Without hesitation, without any apparent concern for the rules that Ekido was mentally reciting, Tanzan bent slightly and lifted the young woman in his arms, holding her carefully as one might carry something precious, but not fragile, with respect and steadiness. She held her bundle with one hand and steadied herself with the other hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Then Tanzan stepped into the muddy water. The current pushed against his legs, seeking to throw him off balance, but his steps were sure and measured. He had crossed many streams in his years of traveling, knew how to read the water, where the rocks would be stable, where the current would be weakest. Slowly, methodically, he made his way across, water swirling around his calves, sometimes reaching his knees where the channel ran deeper. The young woman held very still, trusting his balance, her weight distributed carefully so as not to shift suddenly and cause them both to fall. On the far side, Tanzan set her down gently on dry ground, steadying her until she found her footing. She bowed deeply, thanking him multiple times, her gratitude sincere and effusive. He simply smiled, nodded, and said he hoped her grandmother would recover soon. Then he turned and waded back across the stream to where Ekido stood watching with a face like thunder, and together the two monks continued on their journey. Ekido said nothing at first. He walked beside Tanzan in rigid silence, his jaw tight, his hands clasped firmly in front of him. His mind was churning like the muddy water they had just crossed. How could Tanzan have done such a thing? How could he have violated such a fundamental rule? The precepts were clear about contact with women. They existed to prevent attachment, to maintain purity of practice, to avoid any appearance of impropriety. And Tanzan had not just brushed against her accidentally or offered his staff for support. He had lifted her, carried her, held her in his arms for the entire crossing. It was a blatant, undeniable breach of conduct. The afternoon wore on. The two monks walked perhaps 2 miles, then 3, then 4. The road began to dry out as they climbed into higher country, away from the flooded lowlands. The sun emerged from behind the clouds, warming their damp robes. Birds sang in the trees along the roadside. The beauty of the day was lost on Ekido, whose mind was still back at that muddy crossing, still turning over what he had witnessed, still building his case against what Tanzan had done. He glanced sideways at his companion, who seemed completely at ease, occasionally humming a tune under his breath, pausing once to watch a butterfly navigate between wildflowers. How could he be so calm? Did he feel no remorse? Did he not understand the seriousness of what he had done? The silence grew heavier between them with each step, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of unspoken accusation, of judgment held in reserve, but gathering strength. Finally, after they had walked for more than an hour, after the sun had moved considerably lower in the western sky, and the first evening shadows had begun to stretch across the road, Ikido could contain himself no longer. The words burst out of him like water through a broken dam, all his carefully constructed arguments spilling forth at once. "Brother Tanzan," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "I must speak to you about what happened at the crossing. What you did back there was completely inappropriate. Surely you know this. Surely you remember the precepts about contact with women. We are monks. We have taken vows. We have committed ourselves to a life of purity and discipline. And yet you lifted that woman and carried her across the stream. You held her in your arms. For several minutes you had physical contact with her. This is explicitly forbidden. This is a violation of everything we stand for." He was breathing hard now, his face flushed, months or perhaps years of rigid self-control, finding an outlet in this moment of righteous indignation. "How can you be so casual about this? How can you act as if nothing happened? You have broken your vows, brother. You have compromised your practice, and you show no sign of recognizing the severity of what you have done. I have been walking beside you for over an hour, waiting for you to acknowledge your error, to express some remorse, to show some awareness of your transgression. But you have said nothing, nothing at all. You walk along as if you had merely helped someone with directions, instead of violating one of our most fundamental rules." Tanzan listened to this entire speech without interrupting, his expression patient and attentive. When Aikido finally fell silent, exhausted by his outburst, Tanzan walked on for a few more steps in silence. Then he stopped, turned to face his companion fully, and spoke with a gentleness that somehow made his words land even more powerfully. "Brother Aikido," he said quietly, "I set that woman down on the far side of the stream more than an hour ago. Are you still carrying her?" The words hung in the air between them like a bell that had been struck, its tone still resonating long after the initial sound had faded. Aikido opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He felt as if he had been walking confidently along a familiar path and had suddenly stepped into empty air. That moment of disorientation when the ground disappears beneath your feet and you realize you have been standing on nothing solid at all. Tanzan continued, his voice carrying no judgment, no triumph, only a kind of compassionate clarity. "I carried her across the water because she needed help, and I was able to provide it. The crossing took perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. When I set her down on the far side, my contact with her ended. She went on to care for her sick grandmother. I returned to the path. I am no longer carrying her. But you, my friend, you have been carrying her in your mind for this entire hour. You have been holding her, examining her, thinking about her, replaying that moment again and again. Who has been more attached? Who has been carrying the greater burden?" "The Buddha taught us," Tanzan went on, "that hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world, that by non-hatred alone is hatred appeased, that this is a law eternal. The same is true of all difficult emotions, all the ways the mind becomes tangled and tight. You are angry at me for what you perceive as a violation. But notice what this anger has done to you. It has followed you up this entire mountain path. It has colored everything you have seen and heard for the past hour. It has kept you from experiencing this beautiful afternoon, this bird song, this sunshine. The woman has gone on her way. I released her an hour ago. But you are still holding her, still arguing with what happened, still trying to make reality conform to your idea of what should have been. Ekido felt something crack open in his chest, similar perhaps to what the professor had felt when watching tea overflow from a cup. All the righteousness drained out of him in an instant, leaving him feeling tired and somehow lighter at the same time. He had been so certain of his correctness, so sure that he was upholding the Dharma by maintaining his disapproval. But Tanzan was right. He had been carrying that woman in his mind far longer than Tanzan had carried her in his arms. He had been so busy defending the rules that he had forgotten the purpose behind them, to free the mind from attachment, to cultivate compassion, to respond to the needs of each moment with clarity and presence. "I see," Ekido said finally, his voice small and stripped of its earlier conviction. "I have been carrying her. I have been so attached to my idea of what you should have done that I lost sight of what I was doing to myself. Forgive me, brother." Tanzan smiled and placed a hand briefly on Ekido's shoulder. "There is nothing to forgive. You have learned something valuable today. We both have. The rules are important, yes. They guide us, protect us, help us maintain our practice. But they are like a raft for crossing a river, useful for getting us to the other shore, but not something to carry on our heads once we have arrived. The purpose of the precepts is to free us from attachment, not to create new attachments to the precepts themselves. I carried that woman across the water because that was what the moment required. Then I set her down. If I had refused to help her because of attachment to the rules, I would still be carrying the rules, still burdened by my own rigidity. Either way, we carry something. The question is whether we know when to pick things up and when to set them down. They walked on together in a different kind of silence now, one that held understanding rather than judgment, spaciousness rather than tension. The sun continued its descent, painting the clouds with shades of orange and pink, and both monks were able to see it, to appreciate it, no longer separated by the burden that Ekido had been carrying. Perhaps you know what it is like to carry something long after you should have set it down. A comment someone made that stung, replayed 100 times in memory, growing heavier with each repetition. A mistake you made, lifted and examined and judged again and again, though the moment itself has long since passed. A hurt that was done to you, carried for months or years, until it becomes part of your posture, the way you move through the world, the weight of it shaping your shoulders and your spine. The other person has moved on, but you are still carrying them, still holding the moment, still arguing with what was or what should have been. What would it mean to set it down? Not to pretend it never happened, not to say it didn't matter, but simply to acknowledge that the carrying has gone on long enough. To say, as Tanzan might have said, "I was carrying this, and now I am setting it down." Not with force or drama, but with the same simple decisiveness with which you would set down a bag after a long journey home. Your arms are tired. The destination has been reached. There is no need to keep holding it. Let your shoulders drop just a little more as we prepare to move toward our next story. Feel where you might be gripping something invisible, some old anger or hurt or resentment, and see if you can soften around it just for this moment. You don't have to resolve it or understand it, or even forgive it necessarily. You can simply notice that you are carrying it, and consider whether you might set it down, here, now, on the side of this path where we walk together through stories older than any of our individual hurts, stories that have survived centuries because they point to something true about the human he, RT, and its endless capacity to burden itself with what could be released. From the muddy road where two monks learned about carrying and releasing, we now climb higher into the mountains of Japan, to a place where the air grows thin and cold, where human dwellings become sparse, and where a certain Zen monk named Ryokan lived in a hut so simple it barely deserved the name, Ko. If the last story taught us about releasing what we carry in our minds, this one invites us to consider what we offer to the world when we ourselves have almost nothing to give, and how generosity can flow from emptiness as naturally as water flows downhill. Ryokan was not like other monks. He had studied in the great monasteries, had mastered the texts and practices, had proven himself capable of the rigorous discipline that monastic life demanded. But something in him resisted the formality, the hierarchy, the way temple life could sometimes become more about maintaining tradition than about actually seeing clearly. So he left. He walked away from comfort and status and the respect that comes with being a recognized teacher, and he went up into the mountains where he found an abandoned hut that hunters had once used during winter, and he decided to make it his home. The hut was barely 10 feet square, with walls made of rough wood that had weathered to a silver grey, and a roof that leaked in 3 places when it rained. There was no floor, just packed earth that turned to mud during storms. Ryokan owned almost nothing. A sleeping mat woven from straw, a single robe that he washed in the mountain stream and wore while it was still damp, a wooden bowl for begging, another for eating, and a few scrolls of poetry that he had copied out himself on scraps of paper given to him by villagers. At night, he would sometimes write poems on these papers by the light of the moon coming through the cracks in his walls, because he was too poor to afford oil for a lamp. But Ryokan was not sad or bitter about his poverty. In fact, those who met him often remarked on the particular quality of joy that seemed to radiate from him, as if he had discovered some secret about life that made possessions irrelevant, or perhaps had never learned to desire them in the first place. He would spend his days walking in the mountains, sitting in meditation by the stream, playing with children from the nearby village who were not yet old enough to be afraid of hermits, and occasionally going down to beg for rice when his stores ran low. It was late autumn when our story takes place, one of those crystalline nights when the first real cold has settled into the mountains and the stars seem close enough to touch. Ryokan had spent the day walking through the forest, watching leaves fall, observing how each one descended through the air with its own particular motion, spiraling or gliding or tumbling, depending on its shape and weight. He had eaten a simple dinner of rice and pickled vegetables, and now he sat in his hut with the door open, looking out at the night. The moon was 3 days past full, still bright enough to cast shadows, and it hung in the eastern sky like a lantern hung by some celestial hand. Ryokan sat and watched it rise, watched how its light transformed the familiar landscape into something mysterious and silvered, how the rocks and trees became studies in black and white, all colour drained away, all complexity reduced to light and shadow. He felt the cold air on his face, smelled the scent of pine in approaching winter, heard the distant sound of a stream talking to itself over stones. This, he thought, is enough. This is everything. He was so absorbed in this moment of simple presence that he did not hear the footsteps approaching his hut, did not notice the darker shadow that detached itself from the other shadows and crept toward his door. The first he knew of the intruder was when he turned and saw a man standing in the doorway, breathing hard, his face tense and desperate in the moonlight. The man was young, perhaps 25, thin and poorly dressed, with the look of someone who has been running from something for a long time. In his hand he held a knife, though he held it uncertainly, as if he were not quite sure what to do with it, or whether he would really have the courage to use it. He stared at Ryokan with wide eyes that held equal parts fear and aggression. "Your money," the thief said, his voice shaking slightly. "Give me whatever you have. Money, food, anything of value. I know monks beg from the villagers. You must have something." Ryokan looked at the young man with an expression of such genuine concern that the thief was momentarily confused. "Oh dear," the monk said, standing up slowly so as not to startle his visitor. "I am so sorry you have come all this way. This must be very disappointing for you. Please look around. See for yourself what I have." He gestured to the interior of the hut, where everything he owned was visible in a single glance. The sleeping mat, the 2 wooden bowls, the scrolls of poetry that would be worthless to anyone who could not read. There was no chest, no hidden compartment, no secret store of anything. The complete inventory of Ryokan's worldly possessions would not have fetched enough at market to buy a decent meal. The thief looked around, his face falling. He had walked for miles up this mountain path, had worked up his courage for this theft, and now he found there was nothing worth stealing. The knife lowered slightly in his hand. "You have nothing," he said, disbelief and disappointment warring in his voice. "Nothing at all." "Well," Ryokan said thoughtfully, "I have this robe. It is old and has been patched many times, but it still keeps me warm. You look cold. Please take it. I can get another one eventually." Before the thief could respond, Ryokan untied his robe and slipped it off his shoulders, standing there in only his thin undergarment, his skin immediately raising in goosebumps from the cold mountain air. He folded the robe carefully, with the same attention he gave to everything, and held it out to the young man. The thief stared at him as if he had gone mad. "You are giving me your robe? Just like that? I broke into your home. I threatened you with a knife. And you are giving me your clothes?" Ryokan smiled, and there was such genuine warmth in that smile that the thief felt something twist in his chest, something he had not felt in a long time, something that might have been shame or might have been the first stirring of conscience. "Yes," the monk said simply, "you came all this way. You clearly need it more than I do. I would give you more if I had it. I wish I could give you money or food, but this robe is all I have to offer. Please take it. Consider it a gift from one traveler to another on this difficult road we all walk." The thief reached out slowly and took the robe, his hand trembling. He looked at it, then at Ryokan, standing there in the cold, then back at the robe. Something in his throat seemed to close up, making it hard to breathe. Without another word, clutching the robe to his chest, he turned and fled into the night, running back down the mountain path as if pursued by demons, though the only thing pursuing him was his own confusion and the beginnings of something that might have been gratitude or grief or some mixture of both. Ryokan watched him go, standing in the doorway of his hut in his undergarment, shivering now as the cold truly began to bite. Then he sat down again in his usual spot, wrapped his thin arms around himself for warmth, and looked up at the moon. It had climbed higher now, and its light seemed even brighter, flooding the mountainside with that peculiar luminosity that makes everything seem both perfectly clear and utterly mysterious at the same time. "Poor fellow," Ryokan said aloud to the empty night. "I wish I could have given him this beautiful moon." He sat there for a long time, cold but somehow completely at peace, looking at the moon and thinking about the young thief running down the mountain with a patched robe that would maybe keep him warm for a few more winters. The Buddha had taught that we should conquer anger through gentleness, unkindness through kindness, greed through generosity, and falsehood by truth. But Ryokan had not been thinking of the Buddha's teachings in that moment. He had simply responded to what he saw a person in need, more desperate and poor than himself despite his own poverty, and he had given what he could. This is the thing about true generosity. It does not calculate. It does not measure what it gives against what it has or what it might need later. It does not stop to consider whether the recipient deserves the gift or has earned it through good behavior. True generosity flows like water, finding its way to the lowest place, seeking always to fill what is empty. Ryokan had so little that he could afford to give everything, because he had already learned the secret that having nothing and having everything are sometimes the same thing, depending on how you hold what you have. Later, much later, Ryokan would write a poem about that night. The calligraphy would be shaky because his hands were cold as he brushed the characters onto paper, but the words would be clear. "The thief left it behind the moon at my window." In those few syllables he captured something essential about the nature of wealth and poverty, of taking and giving, of what can be stolen and what cannot. The young thief ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out beneath him. He ran through the dark forest where the moonlight barely penetrated, stumbled over roots and rocks, fell once and scraped his hands, got up and kept running. And all the while he clutched the robe to his chest, feeling the warmth of it, feeling also the strange warmth of the encounter itself. The way the monk had looked at him, not with fear or anger, but with something that might have been compassion, or might have been simple recognition, one human being's, eyeing another human being, both of them cold, both of them struggling, both of them making their way through the darkness as best they could. When he finally stopped, breathing hard, leaning against a tree at the edge of a clearing where the moonlight could reach him again, he unfolded the robe and looked at it properly for the first time. It was indeed old and patched, mended in a dozen places with careful stitches. Whoever had sewn those patches had taken time, had made sure each stitch was placed just so, had treated this old worn garment as if it was something precious. The thief thought of the monk standing in the cold in nothing but his undergarment, giving this away without hesitation, without reproach, without even seeming to notice that he was being robbed. He put the robe on, and it was still warm from Ryokan's body. He pulled it close around himself, and for the first time in years, he began to cry. Great, wrenching sobs that came from some deep place he had forgotten existed, the place where shame and gratitude and confusion all lived together, where the person he had become met, the person he might have been, where the choice he had made tonight to take what was not his was answered by another person's choice to give what he did not have to spare. What the thief did not know, could not know, was that this single act of inexplicable kindness would change the course of his life. Years later, he would become a monk himself, would spend his days teaching children and caring for the poor, would tell the story of a hermit on a mountain who gave away his only robe to a thief and then wished he could have given him the moon as well. But that was all in the future. A future that began in this moment of breaking open, of receiving a gift he had not earned and did not deserve, but that somehow reached past all his defenses and touched something essential. Back in his hut, Ryokan eventually grew too cold to sit outside any longer. He went in, lay down on his straw mat, and curled up for warmth. The temperature continued to drop throughout the night. In the morning he would wake stiff and sore, would spend the day slowly warming up by the stream in the autumn sunlight. But for now, as he drifted towards sleep, he felt no regret, no resentment, no sense of loss. He had given what he could give. The moon was still there, beautiful and whole, shining on the just and the unjust alike, on those who had robes and those who did not, on hermits in mountain huts and thieves running through forests, on all of us who make our way through this life, taking and giving, giving and taking, trying to figure out which is which and when is when. What do you have that you could give away? Not because you should, not because some teaching tells you to, but simply because someone needs it and you have it, and in that moment the giving seems as natural as breathing. Maybe it is not a robe. Maybe it is not even something tangible. Maybe it is attention given freely to someone who is lonely. Maybe it is patience extended to someone who is trying your patience. Maybe it is forgiveness offered to someone who has not asked for it. Maybe it is simply the willingness to see another person clearly, without judgment, without the usual categories of deserving and undeserving, worthy and unworthy. Let yourself settle deeper now, feeling the warmth that surrounds you, the comfort that is yours in this moment. And as you rest, consider that you are like Ryokan in his hut, with less than you think you need, but somehow still whole, still able to give, still capable of looking at the moon and finding it enough, finding it everything, finding in its light a wealth that no thief could ever carry away. From the mountain where Ryokan gave away his only robe and wished he could give the moon as well, we now journey deeper into the paradoxes of Zen practice, to a teaching that cannot be understood through thinking alone, a riddle that exhausts the mind until something beyond mind can finally emerge. If generosity asks us to give without calculation, this next teaching asks us to listen without comprehension, to seek without finding, to hold a question so impossible that it breaks open the very ground we stand on. There was a Zen master named Hakuin who lived during the Tokugawa period in Japan, a time when the old ways were calcifying into mere ritual and form, when temples had become wealthy and comfortable, when monks recited sutras by rote without penetrating their meaning. Hakuin saw this decline, and it troubled him deeply, not with anger, but with the kind of fierce compassion that refuses to let people sleep when the house is burning. He became known for his intensity, for his demanding teaching style, for his unwillingness to let students rest in comfortable understanding. Hakuin had himself struggled for years before breaking through to clarity. He had meditated until he collapsed, had pushed himself to the edge of madness and beyond, had experienced moments of insight followed by months of doubt, had nearly given up dozens of times before finally encountering the great death and rebirth that marks genuine awakening. Because of this, he had no patience for students who wanted enlightenment to come easily, who thought they could read about Zen in books and call that understanding, who believed that sitting quietly for a few minutes each day would somehow transform their consciousness without any real struggle, or surrender. To his students, Hakuin would pose koans questions or statements that could not be answered through ordinary logic, riddles designed to short-circuit the rational mind and create an opening for direct seeing. Some of these koans came from ancient collections, passed down through generations of teachers, but Hakuin also created new ones, including what would become perhaps the most famous Zen koan in the world. A question so simple a child could understand the words, yet so profound that monks would wrestle with it for years. On a winter morning when snow lay thick on the monastery roof and the meditation hall was cold enough that breath formed visible clouds, a young monk named Toyo came before Hakuin for private instruction. Toyo had been at the monastery for 3 years, had proven himself diligent in practice, had memorized many sutras and could discourse eloquently on Buddhist philosophy. He was intelligent and sincere, and precisely because of this, Hakuin knew he needed to be given something that would utterly confound his intelligence, that would make his sincerity wrestle with impossibility. "Master," Toyo said, bowing deeply, "I have studied the teachings and practiced meditation with all my heart. I have read that the Buddha taught about the sound of 2 hands clapping, how when conditions come together, effects arise. But I wish to go deeper. I wish to understand the true nature of reality. Please give me a koan to work with." Hakuin looked at him with eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone into the very structure of Toyo's thinking, the elaborate scaffolding of concepts and beliefs that the young monk had built up over years of study. "Very well," Hakuin said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room like the sound of a large bell. "You know the sound of 2 hands clapping. Now show me what is the sound of 1 hand." Toyo sat perfectly still, waiting for the rest of the question, for the explanation or context that would make this statement make sense. But Hakuin said nothing more. He simply sat there, looking at Toyo with absolute presence, absolute expectation, as if he had asked the most obvious question in the world and was waiting for an equally obvious answer. "What is the sound of 1 hand?" Toyo repeated, wanting to make sure he had heard correctly. "Yes," Hakuin said. "Show me the sound of 1 hand clapping. When you have found it, come back and tell me, not before." He rang a small bell to signal that the interview was over, and Toyo found himself bowing and backing out of the room, his mind already churning, trying to get purchase on this impossible question. What is the sound of 1 hand? 1 hand cannot make a sound by itself. It takes 2 hands striking together to create the clap. This was obvious, elementary. But Hakuin was not a fool. He would not ask an idiotic question. There must be some meaning hidden in it, some trick or test that Toyo was not yet seeing. For the next week, Toyo's every waking moment was consumed by this question. He would be eating his rice and suddenly think perhaps the sound is like this, the scraping of the spoon against the bowl. He would rush to Hakuin's room and demonstrate, making the scraping sound. Hakuin would listen, then shake his head. "No, that is the sound of a spoon and a bowl. Show me the sound of 1 hand." And Toyo would be dismissed, sent back into the cold monastery corridors to continue his seeking. He tried everything. He clapped 1 hand against his thigh and presented this sound to Hakuin. "That is the sound of hand meeting leg," Hakuin said, "not the sound of 1 hand alone." Toyo went into the forest and listened to the wind moving through the pine trees, the whisper and susurration of branches swaying. He brought this sound to Hakuin, using words to describe it, even trying to imitate it with his breath. "That is the sound of wind and trees," Hakuin said. "Where is the 1 hand in this?" Weeks became months. Toyo tried presenting the sound of dripping water, of crickets chirping, of his own breath, of silence itself. Each time Hakuin would reject the answer, not with frustration but with a kind of patient inevitability, the way a mountain remains unmoved no matter how many times you push against it. And with each rejection, Toyo felt his mind becoming more desperate, more fragmented, more exhausted. He stopped sleeping well. He would lie on his mat at night, and the question would circle endlessly through his thoughts like a tiger pacing in a cage. What is the sound of one hand? What is the sound of one hand? The words lost their meaning and became just sounds themselves, a mantra of confusion, a prayer directed towards something he could not name. His fellow monks noticed that his eyes had taken on a slightly wild look, that he walked past them without seeing them, lost in contemplation of this impossible riddle. The Buddha taught that just as rain does not break through a well-thatched house, so passion never penetrates a well-developed mind. But what Toya was experiencing was not the calm imperviousness of a developed mind. It was more like his mind was being systematically demolished. Each clever answer he brought to Hakuin, another support beam removed, until the entire structure was beginning to sway and crack, threatening to collapse entirely. He went to the senior monks for advice. They smiled at him with a mixture of sympathy and recognition. We all struggled with our first koan, they told him. Keep sitting with it. Keep bringing answers to the master. Eventually something will break through. But their words offered no real comfort, because Toyo could feel that this was not about finding the right answer among many possibilities. This was about something else entirely, something that had to do with the question itself rather than any answer to it. One night, after 6 months of this torment, Toyo sat in the meditation hall long after the other monks had gone to sleep. The hall was dark except for the small flame of the single candle, and completely silent except for the occasional crack and settle of the wooden building adjusting to the night temperature. He had given up trying to find answers. He just sat there, exhausted, empty, his mind worn smooth by months of fruitless seeking. And in that exhaustion, something shifted. It was not that he found an answer. It was more that the question itself began to dissolve, the way a wave dissolves back into the ocean, the way a knot unties itself when you stop pulling on it and simply observe how it is constructed. The sound of one hand. Why was he looking for a sound? Why did there need to be a sound at all? Two hands clapping create a sound through meeting, through relationship, through the dynamic interplay of separation and coming together. But one hand, he sat very still, barely breathing. One hand, existing by itself, prior to the question of sound or silence, prior to the distinction between clapping and not clapping. One hand as it is before any concept of one or hand or sound arises in consciousness. One hand as the ground from which all sounds and silences emerge. Not a thing that can be pointed to or named, but the very pointing itself, the very naming itself, the awareness that is present before and during and after any particular experience. Toyo felt tears running down his face, though he could not have said whether they were tears of relief or frustration or something beyond either. He did not have words for what he was sensing, did not have concepts to wrap around it, but something had undeniably shifted. Some locked door in his consciousness had begun to open, not because he had found the right key, but because he had finally stopped believing in doors and keys altogether. In the morning, he went to Hakuin for his regular interview. He bowed, sat down, and simply raised his hand. He did not make any sound. He did not say anything. He just raised one hand and held it there, steady and silent, looking directly at Hakuin with eyes that were no longer searching, no longer hungry for approval or confirmation, but simply present. Hakuin looked at him for a long moment, and the quality of that looking was different than before. Then the master picked up his stick and struck Toyo sharply on the shoulder. "Good," he said. "You have heard the sound of one hand. But Toyo, that is only the beginning. Keep listening. What is the hand itself? What is the listening? What is doing the hearing before sound arises? Do not stop here. Go deeper." And Toyo understood that the koan had not been solved, would never be solved in the way a math problem is solved. It had simply opened, the way a flower opens, revealing new depths that led to further depths, questions beneath questions beneath questions. The sound of one hand was not an answer to be found, but a direction to walk, a way of being with reality that did not require it to make logical sense before you could experience it directly. He bowed again, and this time his bow was different too. It was not the bow of a student to a teacher, though it was that. It was not the bow of gratitude, though it contained gratitude. It was more like the bow of recognition, one emptiness bowing to another emptiness, one hand acknowledging the impossible sound of itself. Years later, Toyo would become a teacher himself, and students would come to him asking for koans to work with, and he would sometimes give them the same question that had tormented and transformed him. What is the sound of one hand? And he would watch them go through the same process he had gone through, the cleverness, the frustration, the exhaustion, and finally, if they were fortunate, the letting go that allows something beyond understanding to emerge. The purpose of the koan, he would tell these students, is not to make you smarter, it is to make you wise, and these are not the same thing. Wisdom comes when the thinking mind exhausts itself and surrenders, when you stop trying to figure everything out and instead simply become available to what is here, now, before thought divides it into subject and object, sound and silence, one hand and two. Perhaps you too have questions that cannot be answered through thinking, problems that do not yield to logic or analysis. The mind wants to solve them, wants to find the right combination of thoughts that will unlock understanding. But some questions are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be lived with, sat with, allowed to work on you the way weather works on a stone, gradually wearing away the surface until something essential is revealed. What is the sound of one hand? Let this question rest in your awareness now, not to answer it, but simply to feel its peculiar quality, the way it seems to point towards something while simultaneously pointing away from everything. One hand, clapping in silence, making a sound that is not a sound, existing in the space before distinctions arise, before things have names, before the world divides itself into this and that, before even the question of sound or silence makes sense. Feel your own hand now, wherever it rests against your body or the surface beneath you. Feel its weight, its warmth, its simple presence. It is just a hand, and yet trying to fully grasp what a hand is, what it means to be this particular configuration of bones and nerves and skin, leads immediately into mystery. The familiar becomes strange. The obvious becomes impossible to explain. And in that impossibility, something opens, some doorway that was always there, but that you could not see because you were too busy thinking you understood. Let yourself rest in not knowing now, in the space where questions dissolve, and even the questioner becomes questionable. This is the sound of one hand. This very not knowing, this availability to what is, this openness that does not require reality to make sense before it can be experienced fully, completely as it is. From the impossible question of one hand clapping, where thinking exhausts itself and something beyond thought begins to stir, we now drift downriver to another teaching, one that speaks to the very tools we use to cross from confusion to clarity, and what we must do with those tools once they have served their purpose. If the koan teaches us about the limits of thought, this parable teaches us about the limits of teachings themselves, even the most profound ones, even the Dharma that guides us home. The Buddha was sitting beneath a tree by the banks of the Ganges River, surrounded by his disciples, when a Brahmin approached with a question. This was not unusual. People came to the Buddha constantly with questions, some genuine and some meant to trap him, some simple and some impossibly complex. But this Brahmin's question was one that went to the heart of practice itself, to the relationship between method and goal, between the path and the destination. The afternoon was hot and the river flowed past them with the steady sound that running water makes, that sound which is always the same and always different, moment by moment. The disciples sat in the shade of the great Bodhi tree, its leaves moving slightly in whatever breeze found its way through the thick air. Some of them were drowsy from the heat. Others sat alert, ready to hear whatever teaching might emerge from this encounter. "Master," the Brahmin said, bowing with respect, "I have heard your teachings about the Four Noble Truths, about the Eightfold Path, about the nature of suffering and the way to transcend it. These teachings are profound, and I am grateful for them. But I am confused about something. Are we to follow these teachings forever? Are we to always be walking the path, always practicing the precepts, always meditating and striving for enlightenment? When does the practice end, or does it go on eternally?" It was a good question, one that many of the disciples had wondered about themselves but had not had the courage to ask. They leaned forward slightly, interested to hear how the Buddha would respond. He was silent for a moment, looking out at the river, and in that silence you could hear the water flowing, and somewhere far away the call of a bird and the rustle of leaves overhead. Then the Buddha began to speak, and as was his way, he did not answer the question directly, but instead told a story, painted a picture, created a scenario that would allow the answer to reveal itself naturally. Imagine, he said, that there is a man traveling through this region who comes to a great river, much like this one we sit beside. He needs to reach the other shore where safety and prosperity await him, where his family is waiting, where his true home exists. But on this near shore where he stands, there is danger. Bandits roam the roads, wild animals prowl at night, the land itself is harsh and unforgiving. He must cross. This is not a matter of preference or curiosity. This is a matter of survival and return to where he belongs. The disciples listened, some of them nodding, already seeing themselves in the story, recognizing the two shores as samsara and nirvana, suffering and liberation, ignorance and awakening. But, the Buddha continued, when the man reaches the river, he finds there is no bridge, no ferry waiting, no obvious way across. The water is deep and the current is strong. If he simply wades in without preparation, he will certainly be swept away and drown. So what does he do? The Buddha paused, letting the question hang in the air. One of the younger monks, eager to show his understanding, spoke up. He must find a way to cross safely, Master. Perhaps he could swim if he is strong enough. Perhaps, the Buddha said, but this man is not a particularly strong swimmer, and the river is wide and treacherous. So instead, he does something else. He gathers materials from the forest around him, branches and bamboo, vines and reeds. He spends time carefully constructing a raft, lashing the bamboo together with vines, making sure it is sturdy enough to support his weight, waterproof enough not to sink. This takes effort and skill. This takes time and patience. But finally the raft is complete. He drags it to the water's edge and climbs aboard. Using a long pole to push off from the bottom where the water is shallow, and paddling with a flat piece of wood where it is deep, he makes his way across the river. The current pushes at him, trying to sweep him downstream, but the raft holds steady. It takes concentration and continuous effort, but gradually, steadily, he makes progress. After some time, perhaps an hour, perhaps more, he reaches the far shore. He pulls the raft up onto the bank and steps off onto solid ground. He has made it. He is safe. He is home. The Buddha paused again, and the disciples waited, knowing the story was not finished, knowing that the real teaching was still to come. Now, the Buddha said, what should this man do with the raft? He has several options. Tell me, what would be the wisest course of action? The young monk who had spoken before thought for a moment and then said, he should hide the raft in the bushes, Master, so that it is there if he ever needs to cross back again. Another monk offered a different suggestion. He should leave it at the water's edge so that other travellers who need to cross can use it. A third monk, older and quieter than the others, said, he should take it with him, Master. After all, he worked hard to build it, and who knows what other rivers he might need to cross on his journey. The Buddha listened to all these suggestions with his characteristic patience, not dismissing any of them, but not confirming them either. Then he spoke again, and his voice carried a gentle firmness. Suppose, he said, that the man thinks to himself, this raft has been very useful to me. It has carried me safely across the water from danger to safety. It has served me well. I put much effort into building it, and it has repaid that effort many times over. But now I am on the far shore. I have reached my destination. The danger is behind me. Would it make sense for me to think, this raft has been so useful that I will lift it onto my head and carry it with me wherever I go from now on? Several of the disciples smiled, or even laughed softly at this image. A man walking around with a raft balanced on his head, struggling under its weight long after it had ceased to be useful. The absurdity was obvious when stated so clearly. No, Master, they said in unison, that would be foolish. And yet, the Buddha said, and now his voice took on a different quality, deeper and more pointed, this is exactly what many practitioners do with the Dharma. They hear the teachings. They practice the methods. These teachings and methods carry them across the river of suffering toward the far shore of liberation. And the teachings are good. They are skillfully made. They hold firm under the weight of practice. They can withstand the currents of doubt and difficulty. But then, having been carried across, having reached a place of understanding and peace, they continue to carry the teachings on their heads. They become attached to the raft. He looked around at his disciples, and several of them shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in this description. Some of you, the Buddha continued, cling to my words as if the words themselves are the truth, rather than merely pointing toward the truth. Some of you practice the meditation techniques I have taught as if the techniques are the goal rather than the means. Some of you quote the sutras and debate the fine points of doctrine, and this has become a new kind of burden, a new kind of suffering. You carry the raft on your heads. The Brahmin who had asked the original question bowed deeply. Thank you, Master. I am beginning to understand. But tell me, should the man simply abandon the raft then? Should he destroy it or discard it carelessly? The Buddha shook his head. No, not carelessly. He should recognize what it is. A raft, a tool, a skillful means that served its purpose. He should lay it down gratefully, acknowledging that it helped him cross, but understanding that carrying it further would be a burden rather than a blessing. Perhaps he leaves it for others to use, as one of you suggested. Perhaps he simply leaves it on the shore and walks on. The important thing is that he does not mistake the raft for the shore itself. He does not confuse the method with the goal. Then the Buddha said something that many of his disciples would remember for the rest of their lives, words that would be repeated and debated and contemplated for centuries to come. He said, if you understand the Dharma as being like a raft, then you should let go even of good states, much less bad ones. Even these teachings I offer you are to be used and then released, not grasped and carried. They are a raft for crossing over with, not for seizing hold of. One of the older disciples, a man who had been with the Buddha for many years, asked quietly, But Master, without the teachings, without the practice, will we not fall back into our old ways? Will we not sink into the river again? The Buddha smiled, and there was great compassion in that smile. Once you have crossed to the far shore, why would you fall back into the river? If you reach the shore and immediately feel you must hold tight to the raft, perhaps you have not truly reached the shore at all. Perhaps you are still in the water, still crossing. And that is fine. Then continue to use the raft. But do not confuse the middle of the river with the far shore. Do not mistake the journey for the arrival. The sun was beginning to set now, painting the river with bands of gold and orange, and the light caught in the leaves of the Bodhi tree, making them glow as if lit from within. The Buddha stood and stretched, his movements natural and easy, and the disciples slowly began to disperse, each carrying with them this teaching about rafts and rivers, methods and goals, holding and releasing. But the teaching went deeper than the words themselves. What the Buddha was pointing to was the way human beings become attached to anything that provides security or identity, even spiritual practices and insights. You sit in meditation for years and finally experience a moment of profound peace, of clarity, of understanding. And immediately the mind wants to grasp it, to make it permanent, to build a philosophy around it, to create a story about the person who had this experience. And in that grasping, the experience itself turns into another kind of raft that you carry on your head, another burden, another thing to defend and maintain. This applies to more than just spiritual practice. Think of all the methods and strategies you have used to get yourself to where you are now. Perhaps there were behaviors that once protected you, but now constrain you. Perhaps there were beliefs that once gave you strength, but now limit you. Perhaps there were relationships that once sustained you, but now drain you. These were all rafts, skillfully constructed, that helped you cross from one shore to another. And if you still need them, by all means continue to use them. But if you have reached a new place, a different shore, consider whether you are holding on to these things simply because they once served you well, even though carrying them further makes no sense. The teaching of the raft is an invitation to continuous letting go, not once but many times, because we cross many rivers in a lifetime. Each crossing requires its own raft, its own method, its own set of tools and teachings. And each arrival at a far shore requires its own laying down. its own grateful acknowledgement that what brought us here need not accompany us further. Even this story itself, this parable of the raft, is just another raft. Even these words flowing past you now, like the Ganges River flowing past the Buddha and his disciples on that long ago afternoon, these are just sounds, just concepts, just fingers pointing at something that cannot ultimately be captured in language. Use them if they help you cross, and then, when you have crossed, set them down gently on the shore and walk on. Lighter now, carried by nothing, carrying nothing, simply walking, simply being, simply arriving, again and again at the shore that was always here, the home that was never really lost. Let your breathing deepen now as we prepare to journey toward our next story. Feel how each breath is also like a raft. It carries you from one moment to the next, brings oxygen to your blood, sustains your life, and then it is released, let go, sent back out into the world. You do not hold on to your breath. You do not try to carry yesterday's breathing with you into today. You simply breathe in, breathe out, each breath complete in itself. Each breath a journey from shore to shore that requires no raft, because the breathing itself is both the raft and the river, and the shores and the crossing all at once. What are you carrying that has already brought you across? What old rafts are you balancing on your head long after the crossing is complete? Not to judge yourself for this carrying, we all do it. It is the most natural thing in the world to hold tight to what has helped us, but simply to notice, to consider, to perhaps, gently, gratefully, begin to set it down. From the riverbank where the Buddha spoke of rafts and letting go, we now travel to a dusty village road where a different kind of teaching unfolds. One born not from philosophy, but from the rawest human grief, from a mother's desperate love meeting the Buddha's fierce compassion. If the raft teaches us about releasing methods once they have served their purpose, this story asks us to consider an even more difficult release. The release of our belief that we alone suffer, that our pain is unique, that death has singled us out for special cruelty. Her name was Kisa Gotami, and before tragedy entered her life like a thief breaking through walls, she had been considered fortunate among the women of her village. She was young and healthy, married to a merchant's son, and after 2 years of marriage she had given birth to a baby boy, a son who would carry on the family name and care for them in their old age. The child was beautiful, with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything, and a laugh that bubbled up from his belly like spring water from stone. Kisa Gotami loved this child with the fierce totality that mothers know, that love which feels less like an emotion and more like the restructuring of reality itself, where suddenly nothing matters except this small being who depends on you for everything. She would watch him sleep and feel her heart might burst from the strange ache of it. She would hold his small hand in hers and wonder how she had lived before, when this hand did not exist, when the world was arranged differently. The boy grew, as children do. He learned to crawl, then to walk, stumbling and falling and rising again with that resilience unique to the very young. He learned to say mama and papa, to point at things he wanted, to express delight at birds and dogs and the way sunlight made patterns on the floor. He was nearing his 2nd birthday when the fever came. It started as nothing, just a slight warmth to his forehead, the kind of thing that children get and shake off within a day. But by evening he was burning, his small body radiating heat like stones that have sat in the sun. Kisa Gotami bathed him in cool water, held him against her chest, whispered prayers to any gods who might be listening. The night was endless. The child cried and then went silent, and the silence was worse than the crying. By morning, when the first light crept through the window, he was gone, just gone, as if the life that had animated him, that had made his eyes bright and his hands reach for her face, had simply departed, leaving behind the strange cold thing that looked like her son, but was not her son, could not be her son, because her son was warm and moved and needed her. This thing did not need anything. This thing was finished in a way she could not comprehend. She refused to believe it. This was a mistake, a momentary problem that could be fixed if she just found the right person, the right remedy. She picked up the small body and wrapped it in cloth and began walking through the village, knocking on doors, begging for medicine. "Please," she said to each person who answered, "my son is sick, very sick. Do you have medicine that can cure him?" and the villagers looked at the bundle in her arms and then at her face, and they understood what she could not yet accept. They turned away, made excuses, closed their doors gently but firmly, unable to bear the sight of her delusion. For hours she wandered, her hair coming loose from its bindings, her voice growing hoarse from pleading. The bundle in her arms grew heavier, but she did not set it down. She could not set it down. To set it down would be to acknowledge something unacknowledgeable, to accept something that would destroy her if she allowed it to become real. Finally, an old man took pity on her. He did not tell her the truth directly. Perhaps he understood that she was not ready to hear it, or perhaps he simply wanted to help her find her way to that truth herself. He said, "There is a great teacher named Buddha who is staying in the grove just outside our village. He is a healer of great wisdom. Perhaps he can help your son. Go to him." Kisagotami walked to the grove, and there she found the Buddha sitting beneath a tree, surrounded by a few of his disciples. She approached and fell to her knees before him, holding out the bundle. "Master," she said, and her voice was cracked and desperate, "they tell me you can work miracles, that you can heal any illness, that your wisdom is without limit. Please, my son is very sick. Please help him. Please bring him back to me." The Buddha looked at her with eyes that had seen 10,000 sorrows, and would see 10,000 more, eyes that did not flinch away from suffering, but met it directly, acknowledged it fully. He looked at the bundle in her arms, and he knew what it contained. His disciples knew too, and they shifted uncomfortably, waiting to see how their teacher would handle this impossible situation, this woman who was asking for what could not be given. But the Buddha did not tell her that her son was dead. He did not try to reason with her, or explain the nature of impermanence, or offer philosophical consolation. Instead, he said something that seemed, on its surface, to give her hope. "I will help you," he said, "but first you must bring me something. Go into the village and bring me a mustard seed from a household that has never known death. From any house where no one has ever died, parent or child, servant or master, young or old, bring me a single mustard seed. When you return with this seed, I will do what you ask." Kisagotami's face lit up with desperate hope. A mustard seed, this was nothing, the smallest and most common thing. Every household had mustard seeds in their kitchen. She could bring him 1,000 mustard seeds if he wanted. "Yes," she said, "yes, I will bring it immediately. Thank you, master, thank you." She clutched the bundle tighter to her chest and hurried back to the village, going now to the houses she had visited before, but this time with a different request. "Please," she said at the first door, "I need a mustard seed for the Buddha. Just one seed. Do you have one you can spare?" "Of course," the woman said, and she turned to fetch one from her kitchen. But then Kisagotami remembered the rest of the Buddha's instruction. "Wait," she said. "The Buddha said it must come from a household that has never known death. Has anyone in your family died?" The woman's face changed, grew sad and distant. "Oh yes," she said quietly. "My husband died 3 years ago, and before that, my mother. And when I was a child, my younger brother drowned in the river. There has been much death in this house. I cannot give you the seed you need." Kisagotami moved to the next house, and the next. At each door the same pattern repeated. Yes, they had mustard seeds. No, they could not give her one, because death had visited their household too. A father lost to illness, a baby who lived only 3 days, a grandmother who died in her sleep, an uncle killed in an accident, a daughter who never woke up one morning. Death had touched every single house, had left its mark on every family, had taken someone from everyone. As the afternoon wore on and Kisagotami went from door to door, house to house, something began to shift in her awareness. At first she was frustrated. Surely there must be one house somewhere that death had not visited. But as she listened to story after story, as she saw the pain in other people's eyes when they spoke of those they had lost, as she began to understand that her experience was not unique but universal, something in her began to crack open. She found herself sitting on the steps of a house at the edge of the village, still holding the bundle, but holding it differently now, with a kind of gentleness that acknowledged what it actually was rather than what she wished it to be. Around her, the village was going about its evening routines. Women were cooking dinner, men were returning from the fields, children were playing in the street, and every single one of these people, she realized, carried loss. Every single one had said goodbye to someone they loved. Every single one had stood where she was standing now, had felt what she was feeling, had been broken by it, and somehow had continued living. The Buddha had taught that many do not realize that we here must die. But for those who realize this, quarrels end. But it was more than quarrels that ended when you truly understood impermanence. It was the illusion of separateness, the belief that your suffering was yours alone, that grief was a private country with only one citizen. Kisa Gotami understood now, sitting on those steps as the sun set and shadows lengthened, that she lived in a world made of loss, that every person was connected to every other person through the common thread of impermanence, of love given and love lost, of holding and releasing, of birth and death, braided together so tightly they could not be separated. She stood up slowly, her legs stiff from sitting, and walked back to the grove where the Buddha waited. When she reached him, she knelt again, but this time she gently laid the bundle on the ground beside her. She had no mustard seed to offer. She had something else instead, understanding born from the most painful kind of teaching, wisdom purchased at the highest price. "Master," she said, and now her voice was different, emptied of desperation and filled instead with a terrible clarity. "I could not find a household untouched by death. I understand now. There is no such household. There has never been such a household. My son has died, as all things that are born must die. I am not alone in my grief. Every mother has lost or will lose someone she loves. Every father, every child, every human being. We are all walking together through this valley of impermanence." The Buddha nodded slowly, his face full of compassion, but also full of something like respect, the acknowledgement of someone who has completed a difficult journey. "You have learned the truth that I could not simply tell you," he said. "If I had told you your son was dead when you first came to me, you would not have heard me. You needed to learn it yourself, to walk through the village and see with your own eyes that suffering is not a punishment given only to you, but the shared condition of all life. Now you can grieve truly, not from a place of isolation, but from a place of connection." "What should I do now?" Kisa Gotami asked. "The pain has not lessened. I still feel as if my heart has been torn from my chest. How do I live with this?" The Buddha gestured for her to sit beside him, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, teacher and student, both human, both subject to the same laws of impermanence and loss. "You grieve," he said simply, "but you grieve knowing that every person who passes you on the street understands something of what you feel. You grieve knowing that your son's death, however brief his life was, connects you to the great truth that the Buddha taught, that all conditioned things are impermanent, that nothing lasts, that clinging to what must change only creates suffering. This does not make the grief less," he continued, "but it changes its flavor. It becomes grief mixed with understanding, pain mixed with wisdom. And in time, though not immediately, this understanding can transform suffering into compassion. Because once you know that everyone loses, that everyone grieves, you can meet other people's pain with recognition rather than with fear or avoidance. You can sit with the bereaved mother and not try to fix her or distract her, but simply be present with the truth that she is living through. Kisa Gotami stayed with the Buddha that night, and for many nights after. Eventually, she became one of his followers, one of the first women to be ordained in his Sangha. She spent the rest of her life teaching others about impermanence, about loss, about the strange comfort that comes from understanding that your personal grief is also universal grief, that in your most private sorrow you are somehow most connected to all other beings. Years later, when she was old and nearing death herself, students would ask her about that day, about the mustard seed that she never found. And she would tell them that she had found it after all. The mustard seed was the understanding itself, small as a seed, but containing within it the potential to grow into something vast. The recognition that we are all temporary, all precious, because temporary, all beautiful, because doomed, all deserving of love precisely because that love must someday on. D. Perhaps you too have searched for a household untouched by loss, a place where pain has not entered, where grief is not known. Perhaps you have felt that your suffering singles you out, makes you different, marks you as somehow cursed or unlucky, or abandoned by whatever forces govern this world. But look around at the other people in your life, really look, and you will see that each carries their own bundle. Each has knocked on doors seeking what cannot be found. Each has learned or is learning the same truth that Kisa Gotami learned walking from house to house through that village to Usand years ago. We are all in this together, this experience of being born and dying, of loving and losing, of building and watching what we built crumble, of planting seeds knowing we may not see them flower. And in that togetherness, in that shared vulnerability, there is something that might not be comfort exactly, but is something more solid than comfort. It is recognition, connection, the knowledge that you do not suffer alone, that your grief is not unique, but universal, that the very thing that feels most isolating actually binds you to every other conscious being who has ever drawn breath and known loss. Let this understanding settle over you now like evening settling over a village, like shadows lengthening across dusty roads where mothers walk, holding what they cannot bear to release, where doors open and close, where stories of loss are shared and shared again, where the mustard seed that cannot be found becomes the wisdom that was there all along, waiting to be discovered through the simple act of looking, listening, recognizing yourself in the eyes of everyone you meet. From the village where Kisa Gotami learned that suffering is the thread connecting all lives, we now turn to another teaching, one that asks us to consider not what we must learn, but what we must not. Waste time trying to learn, not what questions deserve answers, but what questions distract us from the urgent matter of healing. If Kisa Gotami's story taught us about universal suffering, this parable teaches us about the practical wisdom of addressing what is immediate rather than what is merely interesting. There was a man travelling alone through the countryside when he heard a sound that made his blood turn cold, the roar of a tiger, and it was close, too close, coming from the forest to his left. He had been warned about tigers in this region, but had convinced himself that travelling during daylight would keep him safe. Now, as he caught sight of the orange and black stripes moving through the undergrowth, moving toward him with terrible purpose and speed, he understood that his assumptions had been foolish. He ran. There was nothing else to do. The road ahead offered no shelter, no tree sturdy enough to climb before the tiger would reach him, no building where he might take refuge. But to his right, the land dropped away steeply into a ravine, and growing along that edge was a thick vine, old and strong, that disappeared down into the shadows below. Without thinking, operating purely on the instinct for survival, the man grabbed the vine and swung himself over the edge, hanging on with both hands as his feet found the cliff face. The tiger reached the edge and paced back and forth, snarling, its yellow eyes fixed on the man dangling below. It was a young tiger, not experienced enough to know that some prey escapes and some does not, and so it waited, certain that eventually the man would tire and fall or climb back up, and either way would become food. The man clung to the vine and looked down, hoping to find a ledge where he might rest or a path that might lead to safety. Instead, he saw another tiger, an older one, pacing at the bottom of the ravine, looking up at him with the same hungry patience. Two tigers, one above and one below, and he hung suspended between them, his arms already beginning to ache from supporting his weight, his fingers cramping where they gripped the vine. This was bad, worse than bad. This was impossible. He could not go up, and he could not go down. He could only hang here until his strength gave out, and then he would fall to the tiger below, or attempt to climb up and be taken by the tiger above. But then he noticed something that made his situation even more desperate, if such a thing were possible. Two mice had emerged from a crack in the cliff face near where the vine was anchored. One mouse was white and one was black, and they had begun to gnaw at the vine, their small, sharp teeth working steadily through the fibers. White mouse and black mouse, day and night, time itself eating away at the only thing that kept him from falling. The vine that had seemed so strong when he first grabbed it was now being destroyed from both sides, and he could feel it beginning to give way, could feel the slight shifts and movements that meant his time was growing even shorter than he had thought. terror filled him completely. His mind raced through possibilities, through escape plans, through prayers to gods he had half forgotten. Nothing worked. There was no solution, no clever trick that would save him. He was going to die, and soon, and there was nothing he could do about it except hang here and wait for the inevitable. And then, in the midst of this absolute crisis, he noticed something else. Growing from a crack in the cliff face, just within reach of his right hand, was a wild strawberry plant, and on that plant, impossibly red and ripe and perfect, hung a single strawberry. Perhaps it was the nearness of death that sharpened his senses, or perhaps the strawberry had simply been there all along, and he had been too panicked to notice. But now he saw it clearly, saw the way the sunlight caught on its surface, saw the tiny seeds embedded in its flesh, saw how it swayed slightly in whatever breeze found its way into the ravine. He was going to die. The tigers would have him, if not in the next minute, then in the next 10 minutes, if not from falling, then from exhaustion and the inevitable loss of his grip. This was certain. But the strawberry was here now, and so was he, hanging between earth and air, between the tiger of the past and the tiger of the future, suspended in this single moment that contained both his doom and the small, perfect fruit. He reached out with his right hand, using only his left to hold the vine now, his heart pounding at the risk, at the insanity of it. His fingers closed around the strawberry, pulled it free from its stem. He brought it to his mouth and bit down, and the taste exploded across his tongue, sweet and slightly tart. Sun-warmed, perfect. How sweet it tasted. How absolutely, impossibly sweet. This parable was one that the Buddha would sometimes tell, though in different forms, to illustrate a point that his students often struggled to grasp, the point about priorities, about what deserves our attention in any given moment, about the difference between questions that matter and questions that serve only to distract us from the actual situation we find ourselves in. One day, a man was brought before the Buddha with an arrow lodged deep in his chest. The arrow had pierced him during a skirmish between rival clans, and he had been carried by his friends to where the Buddha was teaching, hoping that the great physician of souls might also have knowledge of healing bodies. The man was in considerable pain, and blood was seeping steadily from the wound, but when the Buddha approached to remove the arrow, the man held up his hand. "Wait," the man said, his voice strained. "Before you remove this arrow, I must know certain things. Who shot it? Was he from the warrior caste or the merchant caste? What was his name and what village does he come from? What kind of bow did he use? Was it a longbow or a crossbow? What was the bowstring made from? Was it fiber or sinew or wire? And this arrow itself, what wood is the shaft made from? What feathers guide its flight? Are they from a vulture or a hawk or a peacock? What kind of point does it have? Is it iron or steel, barbed or smooth? And what about the man who shot me? What were his grievances, his motivations? Was this a personal attack, or did he mistake me for someone else?" He would have continued with his questions, but the Buddha held up his hand for silence. The Buddha's face was grave, and when he spoke, his voice carried a kind of fierce compassion, the compassion that refuses to indulge delusion even when delusion feels comfortable. "If you insist on having all these questions answered before allowing me to remove the arrow," the Buddha said, "you will die long before the answers are found. What does it matter who shot the arrow if you bleed to death while investigating? What does it matter what the arrow is made of if it remains in your chest, causing agony and damage with each moment that passes?" The Buddha gestured to the wound, and the man looked down at it, seeing perhaps for the first time the seriousness of his situation, the way his questions had become a kind of shield against acknowledging the urgent reality of his predicament. "This is what you must understand," the Buddha continued. "There are questions that are important and questions that are merely interesting. There are investigations that lead to healing and investigations that lead only to further suffering. You are wounded right now, in this moment. The healing that is needed is immediate and practical. Everything else, all your curiosity about the nature of the arrow and the identity of the archer, these are distractions from the actual work that must be done." The man nodded weakly, and the Buddha removed the arrow with skill and gentleness, and the wound was cleaned and bandaged, and the man's life was saved. Later, when he had recovered, He became one of the Buddha's followers, and he would tell the story to other students who came with elaborate philosophical questions when what they really needed was to address the immediate suffering in their own hearts. The Buddha taught that we should speak with words that are not rough but instructive and truthful so that we offend no one. But sometimes truthfulness requires pointing out when someone is avoiding what is real by focusing on what is abstract. Sometimes compassion means interrupting someone's intellectual curiosity to say, "Look, you are bleeding. Let us address the bleeding before we discuss the metallurgy of the blade." How many of us are like the man with the arrow, demanding to know every detail about how we got wounded before we are willing to accept help? How many times have we stood at the edge of healing and said, "But first I need to understand why this happened to me, what cosmic purpose my suffering serves, what I did to deserve this, what lessons I am meant to learn." And all the while, the arrow remains lodged in our chest, the poison spreads through our system, the wound grows deeper and more infected. The Buddha was not saying that questions about causation are always wrong, or that intellectual understanding has no value. He was saying that there is a time for questions and a time for action, a time for analysis and a time for healing, and confusing these times can be fatal. The man hanging between the tigers understood this in a way that many of us forget, that in the midst of crisis, in the presence of immediate danger or immediate opportunity, the thing to do is not to understand everything, but to respond to what is actually here, now, in this moment. The strawberry was not a solution to the man's problem. Eating it did not make the tigers disappear or stop the mice from gnawing through the vine, but it was what was available to him in that moment. A taste of sweetness, a flash of pure sensation, an experience of being alive that was complete in itself, even though his life was about to end. He could have spent those final moments analyzing his situation, replaying the decisions that had led him to this place, cursing his bad luck or the cruelty of the universe. Instead, he tasted the strawberry. This is not spiritual bypassing or toxic positivity or pretending that real dangers are not dangerous. The tigers are real, the fall is coming, death is certain. But what is also real, equally real, is this moment before the fall, the suspended instant where a strawberry grows from a crack in the cliff and a hand can reach it and a mouth can taste it. Both things are true simultaneously, the doom and the sweetness, the end and the now. Perhaps you have an arrow in your chest right now, some pain or difficulty that demands attention, and instead of addressing it, you have been investigating its origins, building elaborate theories about why it happened, who is to blame, what it means about you or the world or the nature of existence. This investigation might feel important, might feel like necessary work, but the Buddha would ask you, are you bleeding while you investigate? Is the wound growing worse? And if so, might it be wise to stop asking questions and start accepting help? To stop trying to understand everything and start doing something? Or perhaps you are hanging between tigers, suspended in some impossible situation where no good outcome seems available, where every path leads to pain or loss or difficulty. And if this is where you are, then this teaching asks you to consider whether there might be a strawberry growing within reach, some small moment of sweetness or beauty or connection that exists right now, in the midst of everything else. Not as a solution to your problems, not as a way to make the tigers disappear, but simply as something real and present and available, something that can be experienced fully even when everything else is uncertain. The Buddha was a practical teacher. He was less interested in metaphysics than in alleviating suffering. When people came to him asking whether the universe was eternal or finite, whether the soul was identical with the body or separate from it, he would often refuse to answer. These questions, he said, do not lead to dispassion, to cessation, to peace. They are like asking about the bow while the arrow is still in your chest. First, address the suffering. First, do the work of healing. Then, if you still care about those other questions, you can investigate them. But you might find that once the arrow is removed, once the immediate pain is addressed, those questions lose their urgency, or you discover you already know the answers in a way that does not require elaborate philosophical frameworks. Let yourself rest now in this moment, which is like the moment the man tasted the strawberry suspended between what was and what will be. between the past that cannot be changed and the future that cannot be known. Right here, right now, before any of that, there is just this, the breath moving in and out, the softness of whatever you are resting on, the particular quality of the air around you, the specific configuration of sensations that make up this instant of being alive. You do not need to understand why you are tired before you allow yourself to rest. You do not need to trace the causation of every worry before you let yourself release into sleep. The arrow can wait. The questions can wait. The tigers will be there tomorrow if they are going to be there. But this moment, this strawberry moment, this instant of simple presence, this is what is actually available to you now. This is what you can taste if you reach for it. And how sweet it is. From the cliff face where a man tasted sweetness between the jaws of death, we now journey to another precipice, another moment of perfect danger, meeting perfect awareness, where the ancient teaching about living fully in the present moment takes shape in a story so vivid it has been told and retold for centuries, each telling adding new layers while the essential truth remains unchanged. If the poisoned arrow taught us about addressing what is urgent rather than what is merely curious, this tale invites us to consider what it means to be truly awake, truly present, when everything we hold dear is about to be taken from us. The man in this story was traveling through the wilderness, making his way across a vast plain toward distant mountains where he hoped to find work in the mining villages. He had been walking for days, his supplies running low, his feet blistered and sore, but he kept moving because there was nothing behind him worth returning to, and everything ahead held at least the possibility of something better. The plain was mostly empty of life-dry grasses, scattered rocks, the occasional twisted tree that had somehow found enough water to survive. Above, the sky stretched endlessly blue, and the sun beat down with the particular intensity of late summer. He was thinking about water, about how much he had left in his flask, and whether he would reach the stream marked on his rough map before he ran out, when he heard the sound. At first he thought it was wind, but the air was still. Then he thought it might be some distant rockfall in the mountains, but it was too rhythmic, too purposeful. He turned and saw, far behind him, but closing the distance with horrifying speed, a tiger. Not one tiger, but the tiger, the largest he had ever seen, its coat burning orange in the sunlight, its muscles rippling beneath its skin with each bound, its eyes fixed on him with the absolute focus of a predator who has already decided this chase will end in blood. Terror gave him speed he did not know he possessed. He ran, his pack forgotten, and dropped behind him, his lungs burning, his legs pumping. But the tiger was faster, built for this, designed by millions of years of evolution to catch exactly this kind of prey. Slow, soft, defenseless humans who thought their cleverness could substitute for claws and fangs. The distance between them closed steadily, and the man could hear the tiger's breathing now, could almost feel the heat of it on his back. Ahead, the plain ended abruptly. He did not see it until he was almost upon it. A cliff edge, a drop into nothingness, the earth simply stopping and air beginning. He had no time to slow down, no time to consider alternatives. The tiger was 3 bounds behind him, then 2. He reached the edge and leaped, his arms flailing, his body arcing out into space, and by pure luck or providence, his hands caught hold of something. A vine, thick and sturdy, growing from a crack in the cliff face just below the lip. He swung there, gasping, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. Above him, the tiger paced along the edge, snarling its frustration, occasionally swiping at him with one massive paw but unable to reach. The man looked up at those claws, each one as long as his finger, and knew that climbing up was not an option. He looked down, hoping to see a ledge or a path, some way to descend to safety. What he saw instead made his stomach drop sickeningly. Far below, so far that the details were difficult to make out, another tiger waited. This one was older, greyer, and it sat perfectly still, looking up at him with what seemed like infinite patience. It had done this before, that stillness suggested. It knew that what goes up must come down, and it was content to wait. The man hung there, his arms already aching, and understood the trap he was in. Above him, death. Below him, death. and his grip on the vine was the only thing keeping him in the narrow space between those two deaths, keeping him suspended in this moment that could not last, that was already slipping away. His breathing began to slow as the initial panic subsided, and the reality of his situation settled over him like a heavy blanket. This was it then. This was how his life would end. Not in old age, surrounded by family, not in his sleep after a long, full life, but here, hanging from a vine on a cliff face, his arms growing weaker by the minute, caught between two predators who had nothing but time. He thought of his mother, dead now for 5 years. He thought of the girl he had loved and lost. He thought of all the things he had meant to do and would now never do. The thoughts came and went like clouds passing across the sky, and beneath them was a kind of numbness, a shocked acceptance. And then he noticed the mice. 2 of them, emerging from the crack where the vine was rooted in the cliff. One was white as chalk, one was black as night, and they moved with the unhurried purposefulness of creatures following their nature. They approached the vine and began to gnaw at it, their small teeth working steadily through the tough fibers. White mouse and black mouse, day and night, light and dark, time itself made visible and given form, eating away at the only thing that stood between him and the fall. He watched them work and felt something like laughter bubbling up in his chest, though whether it was actual amusement or hysteria he could not have said. Of course there were mice. Of course the vine was being destroyed even as he clung to it. Because it was not enough to be caught between the tigers, he also had to watch his salvation being dismantled piece by piece, had to be conscious of his grip failing, had to know exactly how much time he had left, and watch it shrink with each bite the mice took. The vine shuddered slightly, and he gripped it tighter, which made his arms ache more, which made him aware that whether the mice finished their work or not, his strength would give out eventually. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, perhaps 15. If he was lucky, that was all he had. He was going to fall. The tiger below would have him. This was certain, and in that certainty something shifted. The panic that had been driving him, the desperate search for escape that had filled his mind with frantic half-plans and impossible scenarios, suddenly quieted. What was the point of panic when the outcome was decided? What was the point of fighting when the fight was already lost? A strange calm descended, and in that calm his senses sharpened, became preternaturally clear. He noticed the quality of the light, the way the afternoon sun slanted across the cliff face and made the rock glow golden. He noticed the texture of the vine in his hands, rough and solid, still holding despite the mice's patient work. He noticed the sound of the wind moving through the gorge below, a low rushing that was almost musical. And then he noticed something else. Growing from another crack in the cliff, perhaps 2 feet to his right and slightly above, was a wild strawberry plant. It clung to the rock face in defiance of gravity and common sense, its roots somehow finding enough soil and moisture in the crack to sustain life. And hanging from that plant, perfectly ripe and impossibly red, was a single strawberry. The sunlight caught it and made it seem to glow from within, and the man found that he could not look away from it. A strawberry. Here, in this place of death and waiting, of tigers and falling, of time measured in mouse bites and fading grip strength, a strawberry. It was absurd. It was perfect. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He looked up at the tiger pacing above. He looked down at the tiger waiting below. He looked at the mice gnawing steadily at the vine, white and black, day and night, time itself eating away at time. And then he looked back at the strawberry. The Buddha had taught that watchfulness is the path of immortality, that unwatchfulness is the path of death, that those who are watchful never die, while those who do not watch are already as dead. And the man understood, hanging there between earth and air, between the past that had led him here and the future that would end him, that he had a choice about this present moment. He could spend it in fear, rehearsing his death, imagining the fall and the jaws and the pain. He could spend it in regret, cataloguing his failures and mistakes, the opportunities he had missed and the wrong turns he had taken. He could spend it in anger at the unfairness of it all, at the fact that he was only 32 years old and had so much life still unlived. He could spend it in any of these ways, and they would all be real, all be justified, all be perfectly understandable responses to his situation. or he could reach for the strawberry. The reaching would require letting go with his right hand, trusting his entire weight to his left hand alone, which was already tired and beginning to cramp. The reaching would hasten his fall by maybe a minute, maybe less. The reaching was, by any practical measure, foolish. And yet the strawberry was there, and so was he, and the moment between them was all he actually had, all anyone ever actually has. He reached. His right hand released the vine and extended toward the strawberry, his fingers stretching, his body swaying slightly with the shift in balance. The tiger above roared, sensing that the end was near. The mice continued their work, unbothered by tigers or men or the drama of reaching and falling. His fingers closed around the strawberry, feeling its slight give, its sun-warmed surface. He pulled it free from its stem and brought it to his mouth. He bit down, and the taste flooded his senses, sweet and tart, complex and simple, the essence of strawberry concentrated in this single perfect specimen. Juice ran down his chin, and he did not care. The world narrowed to this taste, this moment, this experience of being alive enough to taste, aware enough to appreciate, present enough to receive this gift that asked nothing of him except that he be here, now, tasting it. How sweet it tasted. How impossibly, wonderfully, heartbreakingly sweet. The vine gave way. Of course it did. The mice had done their work, and time had done its work, and gravity, which never sleeps and never compromises, pulled him down. He fell, and the tiger below took him, as tigers do. But in those final seconds of falling, the taste of the strawberry was still in his mouth, and his last conscious thought was not of fear or regret, but of gratitude. Gratitude for having reached, gratitude for having tasted, gratitude for having been fully alive in that one moment when life was still available to him. The Buddha would sometimes tell this story to students who came to him asking about death, about the afterlife, about what happens when consciousness ceases. And he would say, "You are asking the wrong question. You are hanging from a vine right now. We all are. The tigers are real and the fall is certain. But the strawberry is also real, also here, also available. Which will you attend to? Where will you place your awareness? How will you spend the moments you actually have?" This is not about ignoring reality or pretending that danger is not dangerous. The man knew he was going to die. He did not delude himself about the tigers or convince himself that everything would somehow work out fine. He saw his situation clearly, completely, without flinching. And having seen it clearly, he chose to also see the strawberry, to reach for it, to taste it fully before the end came. Perhaps you are hanging from a vine right now. Perhaps you feel time eating away at your grip. Feel the tigers of past and future surrounding you. Feel the ground preparing to give way beneath your certainties. If this is where you are, then this story asks you, is there a strawberry growing within reach? Is there something sweet and present and real that exists right now, in this moment, regardless of what came before, or what will come after? It might be the taste of your last sip of water before sleep. It might be the softness of your pillow against your cheek. It might be the simple fact of breathing, of being conscious, of being alive enough to hear these words and feel whatever you feel about them. It might be small, this strawberry moment. It might seem insignificant compared to the tigers, but it is what is actually available, what is actually here, what can actually be tasted if you are willing to reach for it. Let your grip loosen now, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement that you have been holding on so tightly, so carefully, trying to keep yourself safe from the fall that is coming, whether you hold on or not. And in that loosening, see if you can taste something sweet, this moment, this breath, the strange and precious experience of being alive right now, hanging between everything that was and everything that will be, suspended in the eternal present where strawberries grow and hands can reach them, and mouths can taste them. How sweet it is! How sweet! From the cliff face where sweetness was tasted in the shadow of death, we drift now onto the surface of a misty lake, where a different kind of teaching waits in the still water and the fog that obscures what is and what only seems to be. If the strawberry taught us about presence in the face of mortality, the story asks us to consider the nature of anger itself, how it arises, what feeds it, and how quickly it can dissolve when we understand what we are actually responding to. Imagine yourself floating on a lake in the early morning, when mist rises from the water's surface and makes the world soft and indistinct, when shapes emerge from the whiteness only to dissolve back into it, when even sound seems muffled and distant. You are in a small boat, perhaps a simple wooden rowboat or a narrow canoe, and you have come out onto the water seeking solitude, seeking the particular peace that comes from being surrounded by water and sky, with nothing human-made in sight except the vessel that holds you. The water is perfectly calm, so still that it reflects the sky like a mirror, and you cannot quite tell where water ends and air begins. Your boat drifts slowly, pushed by currents you cannot see, moving in directions you did not choose but do not resist. There is no destination. There is only this drifting, this floating, this suspension between depths below and heights above. You have set down your oar, and you are simply present, letting the boat take you where it will, letting your thoughts settle like silt drifting down through clear water. This peace you feel is delicate but real, and you have been protecting it carefully, grateful for these moments away from the noise and demands of ordinary life, away from the voices that want things from you, away from the endless tasks that wait at home. Here on the water, you are no one, responsible for nothing, free to simply exist without purpose or direction. The mist wraps around you like a soft blanket, and you close your eyes, feeling the gentle rocking of the boat, hearing the small sounds of water lapping against wood. And then, without warning, something strikes your boat hard from the side, jarring you from your peace, sending waves radiating outward that disturb the mirror stillness of the water. Your eyes snap open and your body tenses, adrenaline flooding your system. Another boat has collided with yours, has come out of the mist and crashed directly into you with force enough that your boat rocks violently and you have to grip the sides to keep from being thrown out. Anger rises in you instantly, hot and righteous. How dare someone be so careless? How dare they intrude on your solitude with such recklessness? You were here first, you were peaceful and still, and now this person has shattered that peace with their incompetence or their disregard. You turn toward the other boat, ready to unleash your frustration, ready to make them understand what they have done, ready to express the full measure of your justified indignation. But as you turn, as your mouth opens to speak sharp words, you see something that stops you completely. The other boat is empty. There is no one in it. It is just a boat, drifting like your own boat was drifting, moved by the same invisible currents, guided by nothing and no one, as innocent of intention as a leaf falling from a tree or a stone rolling down a hill. It is an empty boat, and it has bumped into your boat simply because that is what happens when two objects occupy the same space at the same time, because that is how the water moves, because that is the nature of currents and drift and the random mathematics of two paths crossing. The anger that had risen so quickly begins to dissolve just as quickly. How can you be angry at an empty boat? How can you direct your frustration at something that has no mind, no intention, no awareness of having done anything at all? The boat is just a boat. It did not choose to hit you. It did not mean to disturb your peace. It simply drifted on the water and happened to cross your path, and your paths intersected for a moment, and now they are diverging again as the current carries the empty boat away into the mist. You watch it disappear, and you notice something interesting happening inside yourself. The physical sensations of anger are still present. The tension in your chest, the heat in your face, the tightness in your hands where they grip the sides of your boat. But the anger itself is fading, losing its fuel, because anger needs a target and there is no target here. There is just water and wood and the impersonal physics of two objects meeting. And then, sitting there in your rocking boat as the water slowly settles back to stillness, you begin to wonder about all the other times you have been angry, all the other collisions and confrontations and moments of frustration you have experienced. How many of those involved empty boats? How many times were you struck by something that had no intention behind it, no malice, no awareness of you at all, but you responded as if there were a person steering, a mind choosing to harm you, a deliberate decision to intrude on your peace? The Buddha taught that we should empty the boat, that when the boat is empty we will quickly reach our destination, that we should throw overboard all attachment and hatred and we will obtain nirvana. But this teaching about the empty boat works on multiple levels. like light refracting through water, showing different colors depending on the angle of observation. On one level, it is about how we respond to the world around us. Most of what happens to us is like the empty boat, impersonal, unintentional, simply the result of causes and conditions coming together in ways that sometimes benefit us and sometimes harm us, but without any consciousness behind them choosing one outcome over another. The weather does not rain on your wedding day because it has something against you. The traffic does not snarl on the day you are late because the universe is testing your patience. The person who cut you off on the highway was not thinking about you at all. They were thinking about whatever they were thinking about, wrapped up in their own concerns, operating from their own conditioning and habits, and you just happened to be in the space where their path and your path intersect. Ted, if you can see this, really see it, much of your anger loses its foundation. You cannot maintain rage at an empty boat. You might feel frustration at the disruption, annoyance at the inconvenience, but that hot, righteous fury that demands justice and acknowledgement and apology, that dissolves when you understand there is no one to be furious at, no consciousness that chose to harm you, just the random collision of paths through space and time. But the teaching goes deeper. On another level, emptying the boat means recognizing that you too are an empty boat, or rather, that what you think of as your solid continuous self is more like a boat than you might want to admit, a collection of parts assembled temporarily, moving according to currents and conditions you did not choose and cannot fully control, bumping into other boats and being bumped in return, all of it impersonal, all of it empty of the permanent separate self you imagine yourself to be. When someone does something that hurts you, what actually happens? There are actions and reactions, causes and effects, patterns of conditioning playing out automatically like dominoes falling in sequence. The person who hurt you was pushed by their own pain, their own fear, their own confusion. They were an empty boat being moved by currents they might not even be aware of. And your response to being hurt, the anger, the desire for revenge, the nursing of grievance, these too are just currents, just patterns, just the automatic movements of a boat that thinks it is choosing its direction, but is actually being carried by forces much larger than its small wooden hull. This does not mean that nothing matters, or that harm is acceptable, or that you should simply allow yourself to be battered by every empty boat that drifts your way. You can still protect yourself, still maintain boundaries, still take action when action is needed. But you can do these things without the burning fuel of personal rage, without the story that someone deliberately chose to hurt you because you are you and they wanted to cause you pain specifically. The person who was rude to you in the store was probably not thinking about you at all. They were thinking about their sick child, or their overdue bills, or the argument they had that morning, or the pain in their back that has not gone away for weeks. They were an empty boat drifting through their day, and they bumped into you, and it hurt. But it was not personal. It was not about you. It was about the currents that were moving them, and the currents that were moving you, and the moment when those currents intersected. Can you feel the difference this makes? Can you sense how much energy you have spent in your life being angry at empty boats, maintaining feuds with currents, demanding apologies from the water itself? And can you feel what it might be like to let that go, not because you are weak or because you are excusing harm, but because you finally understand what you are actually angry at? The mist on the lake is beginning to lift now, and you can see farther across the water. Other boats dot the surface, some with people in them and some empty, all of them drifting, all of them moving according to patterns too complex to predict or control. Each boat that holds a person holds someone who thinks they are steering, who believes their actions are chosen and deliberate and arising from some core self that makes decisions. But look closer, and you see that even the people who seem to be rowing are being carried by the same currents as the empty boats. They are not separate from the water. They are part of it, expressions of it, waves that have temporarily taken the form of individuals but will eventually dissolve back into the lake. This is not a depressing realization. It is actually deeply freeing. If you are an empty boat, then there is no solid self that can be permanently damaged by collisions. If others are empty boats, then their actions toward you lose their power to define you or diminish you. You are both just boats on the water, drifting and bumping and separating again, And beneath all of it is the water itself, the vast impersonal awareness that holds all boats equally, that is disturbed by collisions but returns always to stillness. Let yourself float now in this understanding, feeling your boat rock gently on the water, feeling the way it responds to every small movement of the lake beneath it, feeling how you are both separate from the water and completely dependent on it, both an individual vessel and an expression of the Sa, me currents that move everything. And as you float, notice if there are old angers you have been carrying, old collisions you have been replaying in your mind, old empty boats that you have been chasing through the mist, demanding that they apologize for bumping into you. What would it mean to let those boats drift away? Not to say that what happened did not hurt, not to pretend that the collision did not rock your boat and disturb your peace, but simply to recognize that there was no one steering the other boat, or that if there was someone steering, they too were being carried by currents they did not choose, push, ed by winds they did not summon, moved by the same impersonal forces that move all of us through our days. The Buddha said to empty the boat, and perhaps this is what he meant. Empty it of the stories about who is to blame and who owes what to whom. Empty it of the weight of carried grievances and rehearsed confrontations. Empty it of the illusion that any of us are fully in control of our direction or our collisions. An empty boat is light enough to float easily on the surface. An empty boat does not sink under the weight of accumulated anger. An empty boat drifts according to the nature of water and wind, and this drifting, this surrender to currents, this acceptance of what is, brings a kind of peace that is different from the peace of avoiding all collisions. It is the peace of knowing that collisions will happen, that boats will bump into each other, that this is simply the nature of boats and water and the way things move through space. And when you understand this, when you really see it, you can be bumped without being diminished, can be struck without striking back, can feel the impact and let it pass through you like a wave passing through water, disturbing the surface but leaving the depths unchanged. Your boat has settled now into stillness again. The empty boat that struck you has long since disappeared into the mist. The lake is calm, reflective, holding you gently as it has held you all along. There is nowhere you need to go and no one you need to be angry at. There is just this moment, this boat, this water, this vast impersonal kindness that asks nothing of you except that you float, that you drift, that you allow yourself to be carried toward whatever shore awaits you, releasing the oars, emptying the boat, becoming light enough to be moved by the lest current toward home. From the misty lake where empty boats drift and collide without intention, we now make our way to a sculptor's workshop where chips of stone fall like snow and the air is thick with dust that catches the light streaming through high windows. If the empty boat taught us about the impersonal nature of harm, this story invites us to consider what we are made of, what obscures our true nature, and what practice actually means when we understand it, not as addition but as removal, not as becoming something we are not, but as revealing what we have always been. The workshop sits on the edge of a small village in the mountains, a large open room with stone walls and a floor covered in marble dust and granite fragments, the accumulated debris of years of careful work. The sculptor who works here is well known throughout the region, sought after by temples and wealthy patrons who want images of the Buddha for their meditation halls, statues that will help focus the mind and inspire devotion. His Buddhas are remarkable, people say. They seem alive. They seem to possess the very quality of awakening that the Buddha himself embodied. Looking at them, you feel something shift inside, some recognition that is deeper than words. On this particular morning, a young student has come to visit the sculptor, seeking to understand his craft. The student is earnest and intelligent, has studied Buddhist philosophy for years, can recite sutras and explain complex doctrines with clarity and precision. But recently he has begun to feel that all his knowledge is somehow beside the point, that understanding concepts about awakening is not the same as being awake, that he has been learning about water without ever getting wet. He has heard that the sculptor, despite having no formal education and never attending a single lecture on Buddhist philosophy, seems to embody something essential that the student with all his learning still lacks. The student enters the workshop, and finds the sculptor bent over a large block of white marble, his mallet and chisel working steadily, tap, 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 the sound rhythmic and almost meditative. Chips of stone fly away with each strike, revealing gradually what lies beneath. The student watches for a while in silence, not wanting to interrupt, but eventually the sculptor becomes aware of his presence and straightens up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of marble dust across his skin. "Welcome," the sculptor says, his voice rough from years of breathing stone dust but kind. "You have come to watch me work?" The student bows respectfully. "Master, I have come to ask you a question, if you will permit it. Your statues of the Buddha are renowned for their beauty and their spiritual power. People say that looking at your Buddhas helps them in their practice, brings them closer to understanding. I wish to know your secret. How do you create such magnificent Buddha statues? What technique do you use? What is the process that allows you to capture something that seems almost alive?" The sculptor looks at the student for a long moment, and there is something in his eyes, not quite amusement, but not quite seriousness either, a kind of gentle questioning, as if he is trying to determine whether the student is ready to hear the answer he will give. Then he turns back to the block of marble before him, places his chisel, strikes it with his mallet. A chip falls away. He strikes again. Another chip. He continues this for perhaps a minute while the student waits, confused, wondering if his question has been ignored. Then the sculptor speaks, not looking at the student, but at the stone, his hands continuing their work even as he talks. "I do not create Buddha statues," he says quietly. "That is not what I do. I do not make anything at all." The student frowns, not understanding. "But master, clearly you make these statues. I can see you working on one right now. How can you say you do not create them?" The sculptor sets down his tools and runs his hand over the surface of the marble, feeling its texture, its temperature, the subtle variations in its grain. "Look at this stone," he says. "What do you see?" The student looks. "I see a block of marble, rough, unfinished, still mostly shapeless." The sculptor nods. "Yes, that is what most people see. But I see something different. When I look at this stone, I see the Buddha already inside it. The Buddha is already there, complete and perfect, has been there since this marble was formed deep in the earth millions of years ago. The Buddha does not need to be created or constructed or built. The Buddha simply needs to be revealed." He picks up his chisel again, points to a section of the stone where the surface is still rough and irregular. "This here," he says, "this is not Buddha. This is extra stone, stone that does not belong, stone that is covering up and obscuring what is already present." So I remove it. Tap, tap, chips fall away. I do not add anything to the stone. I take away. I remove what does not belong. I chip away everything that is not Buddha, and what remains is Buddha. This is not creation. This is revelation. The student feels something stir in his chest, a recognition that this is not just about sculpture, not just about stone and chisel and the craft of shaping marble. But he does not yet fully grasp what the sculptor is telling him. "Master," he says slowly, "I think I understand what you are saying about the stone. But what does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with practice?" The sculptor smiles, and this time it is definitely amusement in his eyes, but gentle amusement, the kind that comes from recognizing your younger self in someone else. "Everything," he says. "It has everything to do with practice. Tell me, why did you come here today? What are you seeking?" The student considers this. "I seek awakening," he says finally. "I seek to become enlightened, to become a Buddha. I study the teachings and practice meditation and follow the precepts, all so that I can transform myself from what I am now into what I wish to become." The sculptor nods, as if this is exactly the answer he expected. "And this," he says, "is where you are mistaken, where so many practitioners are mistaken. You think practice is about becoming something you are not. You think you must construct a Buddha out of the raw material of your ordinary self, must add knowledge and virtue and wisdom and compassion until gradually you have built something that resembles awakening. But this is backwards. This is not how it works." He gestures to the marble block. The Buddha is already in the stone. The Buddha is already in you. You were never not a Buddha. You were never separate from your true nature, never lacking what you think you must acquire. But you were covered over, obscured, hidden beneath layers of delusion and conditioning and false beliefs about who you are and what you must become. Practice is not about adding these layers. Practice is about removing them. It is about chipping away everything that is not Buddha until what remains is what was always there. The student sits down heavily on a nearby stool, feeling suddenly that his legs might not support him. This is the opposite of everything he has been taught, or at least it seems like the opposite. He has spent years accumulating knowledge, cultivating virtues, building up a storehouse of merit and understanding. And now this sculptor is telling him that all of that is beside the point, or worse, that it might actually be adding more layers of stone that obscure what he is looking for. But Master, he says, his voice uncertain now, if we are already Buddhas, if there is nothing to attain and nothing to add, then why practice at all? Why meditate or study or follow any teachings? Why not just say, we are already enlightened and be done with it? The sculptor picks up a particularly rough section of stone that he has chiseled away and holds it up to the light. Look at this piece, he says. This was part of the block, attached firmly, seeming like it belonged. But it was not Buddha. It was covering Buddha, hiding Buddha, and it needed to be removed. This is what practice does. It shows you what is not essential, what can be removed, what has been obscuring your vision of what you actually are. The Buddha taught that by oneself is evil done, by oneself is one defiled, and by oneself is evil left undone, by oneself is one made pure. Purity does not mean adding goodness on top of badness. Purity means removing the impurities, chipping away the false identifications and habitual patterns and the voice in your head that tells you who you are supposed to be. Each time you sit in meditation and notice a thought arising and let it go without following it, you are removing a chip of stone. Each time you act with compassion, not because you are trying to be a compassionate person, but because compassion is what naturally flows. When you stop blocking it, you are revealing what was always there. The student is quiet for a long time, watching the sculptor return to his work, the steady rhythm of mallet on chisel, the patient removal of what does not belong. Finally he speaks again. Master, how do you know what to remove? How do you know which part is stone that must be chipped away and which part is Buddha that must be preserved? The sculptor pauses in his work and considers this question. It is a good question, perhaps the right question. I have been doing this work for 40 years, he says. In the beginning, I had to think very carefully about each strike, had to plan and measure and proceed slowly, afraid of removing too much or removing the wrong part. But over time, something changed. I began to feel what belonged and what did not. The stone itself began to teach me. I could sense the Buddha inside, could feel where it wanted to emerge and where the excess stone was preventing that emergence. He sets down his tools and looks directly at the student. Practice is the same. In the beginning, you need teachers and teachings, need to be told what is skillful and what is not, what leads toward awakening and what leads away from it. You need the precepts and the meditation instructions and all the guidance that the Dharma provides. But these are like the measurements and plans I used when I first started sculpting. They are useful, necessary even, but they are not the point. The point is to develop your own sensitivity, your own ability to feel what is true nature and what is obscuration, what needs to be removed and what needs to be allowed to shine forth. And how does one develop this sensitivity, the student asks. By removing stone, the sculptor says simply, by practicing, by sitting with yourself day after day, year after year, patiently chipping away at the false beliefs and the defensive patterns and the stories you tell yourself about who you are. Some chips are large, dramatic insights that change everything in a moment. Most chips are small, almost invisible, tiny adjustments in how you see and respond and understand. But each chip matters. Each chip reveals a little more of what was always there. The student stands and approaches the marble block, looking at it with new eyes. He can almost see what the sculptor sees, can almost perceive the shape waiting to emerge from the stone. It is there and not there, present but hidden, real but not yet visible. Like his own Buddha nature, he thinks, like what he actually is beneath all the accumulated layers of conditioning and fear and desire and confusion. "May I try?" he asks, gesturing to the tools. The sculptor hands him the mallet and chisel with a slight bow. "Remember," he says, "you are not creating anything. You are only removing what does not belong. Trust the stone. Trust what you find inside it. And most importantly, trust that the Buddha is already there, has always been there, is not something you must make, but something you must allow to be revealed." The student places the chisel against the stone, feeling its coolness, its solidity, its patient endurance. He raises the mallet and strikes, and a chip falls away. Such a small chip, almost nothing, but the sculptor nods with approval. "Good," he says. "Now do that 10,000 more times, and you will begin to see what was always there. Perhaps you too are like this block of marble, carrying within you something complete and perfect that has been there all along, covered over by years of conditioning and comparison, and the constant voice that tells you that you are not enough, not good, not worthy, not enlightened. And perhaps practice is not about becoming something better than you are. Perhaps it is about removing the layers that convince you that you are anything other than what you have always been: whole, complete, already home, already the Buddha sitting quietly in stone, waiting patiently to be revealed. What needs to be chipped away today? What belief about yourself is just excess stone? What story that you tell about your inadequacy, or your separation, or your need to become something other than what you are? What if that story is not truth, but obscuration, not reality, but just stone covering the Buddha that has been sitting here all along, patient as marble, complete as the dawn? Wah! Waiting only for you to pick up the chisel and begin the gentle work of removal, of revelation, of coming home to what you have never actually left. Rest now in the knowledge that you are not a project to be completed, but a Buddha to be revealed, not a problem to be solved, but a presence to be uncovered. The chips will fall away in their own time. The stone knows how to release what does not belong. And what remains, what was there from the beginning, what will be there when all the excess has been removed? That is what you are. That is what you have always been. That is what no amount of stone could ever actually hide. From the sculptor's workshop, where Buddha emerges from stone through patient removal, we now travel to a small temple in 18th century Japan, where a different kind of removal is taking place, the removal of concern for praise and blame, for reputation and disgrace, for the world's approval or condemnation. If the sculptor taught us that our true nature needs only to be revealed, this story asks us to consider what remains when even our good name is chipped away, when we stand naked before accusation and allow the world to think what it will. The teacher's name was Hakuin, though he appears in different stories at different stages of his life, sometimes as the fierce master demanding impossible answers to impossible questions, sometimes as the compassionate elder whose very presence seemed to transmit peace. In this particular story, he is neither young nor old, neither famous nor unknown, but simply a monk living quietly at the edge of a village, tending a small temple, teaching occasionally, spending his days in meditation and simple work. The village knew him as a good man, perhaps even a holy man. His life was beyond reproach. He owned nothing, desired nothing, harmed no one. Parents would bring their children to receive his blessing. Merchants would seek his advice on ethical matters. Even those who had no particular interest in Buddhism would bow respectfully when they passed him on the road, recognizing in his bearing something that commanded respect without demanding it. Near Hakuin's temple lived a family who ran a food shop, a small establishment selling rice and vegetables and the various provisions that village life required. They had a daughter, beautiful and young, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, with long dark hair that she wore in the traditional style, and a laugh that could be heard from the street when she helped customers in the shop. She was their only child, the focus of all their hopes and plans, and they guarded her reputation as carefully as they guarded their most precious possessions. So when the girl's belly began to swell, when it became impossible to hide the fact that she was pregnant, the parents were not just disappointed or concerned, they were destroyed. In that time and place, an unmarried pregnant girl brought shame not just on herself, but on her entire family. The food shop would suffer. Customers would whisper. The families standing in the village would be ruined. The father's first response was rage. The mother's was tears. But underneath both was the same desperate question. Who is the father? Who has done this to our daughter and to us? The girl would not say. They asked her gently, and she remained silent. They asked her firmly, and she looked at the floor. They asked her with anger and threats, and still she gave no answer. Days passed, then weeks, and her silence held like a wall that no amount of questioning could breach. The parents' rage turned to pleading. The pleading to threats of being disowned, being turned out of the house with nothing, being left to face the world alone with her shame and her child. Finally, under the weight of this pressure, the wall broke. Or perhaps the girl simply made a choice, calculated which outcome would be least destructive, least painful. She gave them a name. She said that the father was Hakuin, the monk who lived in the temple at the edge of the village. The parents stared at her in disbelief. Hakuin, the monk everyone respected, the teacher who seemed to embody virtue and self-control? It was impossible. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. But the girl insisted. Yes, she said, meeting their eyes now with something like defiance or perhaps just exhaustion. Yes, it was Hakuin. He is the father. And she would say nothing more. The father's rage, which had been directed at his daughter, now found a new target. He stormed out of the house and down the road to the temple, his face red, his fists clenched, his wife running behind him trying to calm him, but swept along by her own fury and sense of betrayal. They burst into the temple where Hakuin was sitting quietly, and the father began shouting before he had even fully entered the room. You hypocrite! You pretend to be holy, to be beyond the concerns of ordinary people, but you are worse than any of us. You have ruined my daughter, destroyed my family's honor, and all while wearing the robes of a monk and accepting the respect of this village. What do you have to say for yourself? Hakuin, who had been sitting in meditation, opened his eyes and looked at the man. His face showed no surprise, no indignation, no defensiveness. He simply looked at the father with complete attention, complete presence, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and level. "Is that so?" he said. That was all. 2 words. Is that so? Not a denial, not an explanation, not an argument or a defense or an appeal to his reputation or his years of blameless conduct. Just those 2 words, spoken not with sarcasm or anger, but with a kind of neutral acknowledgement. The way you might acknowledge that it is raining or that a stone is heavy. The father, who had been prepared for denial or excuses or some elaborate explanation that would somehow make sense of the impossible, was thrown off balance by this response. "Yes," he sputtered. "Yes, that is so. My daughter says you are the father of her child, and you sit there and say nothing. You do not defend yourself?" Hakuin inclined his head slightly, as if considering the question. "What would you have me say?" he asked. "Your daughter has spoken. You have heard her words. Is that so?" "Yes, it seems that it is so, since she has said it is so. What more is there to discuss?" The parents left the temple no less angry, but strangely unsatisfied. They had expected rage or shame, or at least some strong emotion that would match their own. Instead, they had received these 2 words, "Is that so?" spoken with such equanimity that they almost seemed to be acceptance, acknowledgement, even confession. The news spread through the village within hours. By evening, everyone knew that the monk Hakuin, who they had thought was above such things, had fathered a child with the shopkeeper's daughter. Some people were shocked. Some were secretly pleased, in the way that people sometimes are when someone held up as an example turns out to be flawed. Some were simply confused. The parents returned to Hakuin's temple the next day with different faces. Not anger now, but a kind of grim determination. "The baby," the mother said. "When it is born, you will take it. You will raise it. This is your responsibility, and we want nothing to do with it. It is yours." Hakuin bowed to them. "Is that so?" he said again. "Very well. When the child is born, bring it to me. I will care for it." Months passed. The girl grew larger. The villagers' opinion of Hakuin shifted from respect to contempt. Parents no longer brought their children for his blessing. Merchants no longer sought his advice. When he walked through the village on his begging rounds, people turned away or gave him nothing, or, worse, gave him food while looking at him with expressions of disgust and disappointment. His reputation, which had taken years to build, was destroyed completely. The Buddha taught that just as a solid rock is not shaken by the storm, even so the wise are not affected by praise or blame. But few people in the village thought of this teaching, and even fewer would have believed it applied to Hakuin, who had fallen so completely from grace. When the baby was born, the parents wrapped it in cloth and carried it to Hakuin's temple. They placed the child in his arms without ceremony, without softness, and turned to leave. The father spoke over his shoulder as they walked away. "This is yours. Deal with it however you can. We never want to see it or you again." Hakuin looked down at the baby in his arms. It was a boy, small and red-faced and crying with the desperate confusion of new life thrust into the world. "Is that so?" Hakuin said softly to the child. "Very well. Let us see what we can do." He had no milk to feed an infant, no cradle, no supplies of any kind. So he went begging, not for himself now, but for the child, going from house to house asking for milk, for cloth, for whatever people could spare. Most doors closed in his face. Some gave reluctantly, motivated by pity for the innocent baby rather than any remaining goodness they saw in the monk who carried it. Hakuin accepted everything with the same quiet gratitude. The generosity and the scorn, the help and the rejection, all of it received with equal grace. He cared for the child with complete attention. He fed it, changed it, soothed it when it cried in the night. He carried it on his back when he went to beg for food. He sang to it, spoke to it, provided everything that he was capable of providing. The baby thrived. And Hakuin's life, which had been simple before, became even simpler, reduced to the basic tasks of keeping this small being alive and comfortable, day after day, night after night. A year passed in this way. And then one day, the girl who had accused Hakuin could no longer bear the weight of her lie. Perhaps it was seeing him carry the child through the village, seeing how gently he cared for it despite everything. Perhaps it was her own conscience finally breaking through her fear. Perhaps it was simply that the real father had abandoned her and she had nothing left to protect. Whatever the reason, she went to her parents and confessed the truth. It was not Hakuin. It had never been Hakuin. The father was a young man from a neighboring village, someone she had met and loved and who had promised to marry her and then disappeared when she told him she was pregnant. She had named Hakuin because she was desperate and afraid, because he seemed like someone who would not retaliate, who would not make her situation worse. She had been wrong to do it. She was sorry. The baby was not his. The parents were horrified, but for different reasons now, not because their daughter was pregnant, but because they had destroyed an innocent man's reputation, had condemned him publicly for something he had not done, had taken his life and his standing in the community and thrown both away based on a lie their daughter had told. They rushed to the temple, both of them this time falling to their knees before Hakuin, apologizing profusely, explaining that there had been a terrible mistake, that their daughter had confessed, that he was not the father after all. They reached for the baby, wanting to take it back, wanting somehow to undo what they had done. Hakuin let them take the child from his arms. He watched as they held the boy, their grandson, seeing them notice how healthy he looked, how well he had been cared for. Then Hakuin spoke, and his voice held no anger, no bitterness, no triumph at being vindicated, no resentment for the year he had spent in disgrace. "Is that so?" he said. That was all. The same two words he had spoken a year earlier when they had first accused him. No elaboration, no demand for public apology, no insistence that they tell the village the truth and restore his reputation. Just those two words, spoken with the same equanimity. The same absolute lack of attachment to how others saw him, to whether the world thought him good or bad, innocent or guilty, worthy of respect or deserving of contempt. The parents left carrying the child, and within days the truth spread through the village just as the lie had spread before. People who had shunned Hakuin now wanted to apologize to explain that they had been misled, to restore him to his former position of respect. But Hakuin received their apologies with the same graciousness he had received their scorn. He seemed not to notice the difference between being praised and being blamed, between being honored and being disgraced. He was the solid rock that the Buddha spoke of, unshaken by the storm, unmoved by praise or blame. What this story reveals is not that Hakuin was indifferent or that he did not care about truth. It reveals that his sense of self was not dependent on what others thought of him, was not constructed from reputation or maintained through the approval of the village. He knew who he was, knew that his knowing was enough, and the world's opinion, whether positive or negative, was like weather passing over the rock, unable to penetrate, unable to change what was essential. Most of us are not like this. We build our sense of self from reflected images, from what we imagine others think of us, from the reputation we cultivate and defend. When that reputation is attacked, we feel that we ourselves are being attacked, that something essential is being destroyed. We rush to defend ourselves, to explain, to correct the false impression, because we believe that the false impression will become us if we do not fight against it. But what if you knew yourself so completely that no false accusation could touch you? What if your sense of worth was so internal, so unshakable, that being praised and being blamed felt exactly the same, like two kinds of weather that pass over without leaving any trace? This is not numbness or disconnection. It is freedom. The freedom that comes from not being controlled by the world's opinion, not being tossed about by praise and blame like a boat on waves. Let yourself rest now in the possibility that you are not what anyone thinks you are, not even what you think you are, but something deeper, something that remains unchanged whether the world condemns you or celebrates you, something as solid as rock, as constant as the awareness that watches all of. This, the praise and the blame, the rise and fall of reputation, the endless weather of human opinion that passes over without ever touching what is essential. Is that so? Let those words settle into your consciousness. Is that so? Not agreement, not disagreement, just acknowledgement that this is what the world is saying, this is what the situation appears to be, and underneath all of it you remain, unchanged, unshaken, as present in disgrace as in honor, as whole when blamed, as when praised, resting in the knowing that needs no one's permission, no one's approval, no one's confirmation except the simple fact of being aware, of being here, of being what you have always been beneath all the names and judgments and opinions that pass like clouds across the face of the sun. From the temple where Hakuin stood unmoved by praise and blame, we now walk into a monastery garden where a young monk has been given a task that seems simple on its surface but contains depths he cannot yet see. If Hakuin's story taught us about equanimity in the face of the world's judgment, this tale invites us to consider what we lose when we pursue perfection too zealously, when our efforts to create purity actually destroy the very life we sought to honor. The monastery sat nestled in a valley between mountains, a place of contemplation and practice, where monks came to study the Dharma and train their minds toward awakening. The buildings were old but well maintained. The meditation halls swept clean each morning, the pathways raked smooth, everything reflecting the order and discipline that the monastic life required. At the center of the monastery complex was a garden, not large but carefully designed, with rocks and gravel arranged in patterns that were meant to suggest mountains and rivers, clouds and mist, the natural world distilled into essence and presented for contemplation. Among the monks living there was a young man named Toyo, earnest and diligent, perhaps 20 years old, who had been at the monastery for 3 years and had proven himself capable and dedicated. He followed the rules precisely, memorized the sutras quickly, sat in meditation for long hours without complaint. His teachers nodded with approval when they observed him, seeing in his discipline and attention to detail the qualities that would one day make him a fine teacher himself. One spring morning, the head monk called Toyo to him and gave him a new assignment. The monastery garden, he said, had been neglected during the winter months. Weeds had taken root between the carefully placed stones. Wild grasses grew up through the gravel that was meant to represent flowing water. The entire space had lost its clarity, its sense of intentional design, and had begun to look wild and unkempt. "Your task," the head monk said, is to restore the garden to perfection. Remove every weed, every stray blade of grass, everything that does not belong. Make it pure again, clean, a proper space for contemplation. Toyo bowed deeply, honoured to be given such an important task. He went immediately to the garden and assessed what needed to be done. There were indeed many weeds, some small and easily pulled, others with deep roots that would require careful digging. The gravel had been disturbed by wind and rain, creating uneven patches where vegetation had found purchase. Even some of the moss that grew on certain rocks seemed to have spread beyond its intended boundaries. Toyo felt the weight of the responsibility. The garden was seen by every visitor, contemplated by every monk who lived here. It represented the monastery itself, and it needed to be perfect. He began his work at dawn, when the light was still soft and the air held the coolness of night. He worked methodically, starting at one corner and moving systematically across the space, pulling every weed he encountered, digging out roots with a small trowel, smoothing the gravel back into its proper patterns. The work was harder than he had expected. Some weeds came up easily, but others clung stubbornly to the earth, breaking off at the surface and leaving their roots behind to sprout again. He had to dig carefully around the stones to extract these stubborn roots, careful not to disturb the placement of the rocks themselves. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the day grew warm. Toyo's back began to ache from bending and kneeling. His hands grew sore from pulling and digging, but he did not stop. The Buddha had taught that one should do what one teaches others to do, that one should avoid all evil and cultivate good and cleanse one's own mind. Toyo understood this teaching to mean that he should complete his task perfectly, should not allow laziness or half measures, should purify this garden just as a practitioner purifies the mind completely, thoroughly, leaving no trace of defilement. By late afternoon, he had covered most of the garden. The change was dramatic. Where there had been chaos and overgrowth, there was now order and clarity. The gravel lay smooth and even, raked into patterns that suggested flowing water with nothing to interrupt that flow. The stones stood clean and distinct, no longer obscured by vegetation growing around their bases. Every weed, every blade of grass, every stray plant that had seeded itself in the garden had been removed. Toyo stood back and surveyed his work with satisfaction. It was perfect, or nearly so. He would finish the last corner tomorrow, and then the head monk could inspect it and see that the task had been completed exactly as instructed. As he was gathering his tools to put them away, the head monk happened to walk past the garden. He paused at the entrance, looking at what Toyo had accomplished. Toyo bowed, waiting for the praise he expected, the acknowledgement of his diligence and thoroughness. But the head monk's face was not pleased. He stood there silently for a long moment, his expression difficult to read, and then he spoke. "It is very clean," he said, "very orderly. You have worked hard." "Thank you, master," Toyo said, hearing something in the head monk's tone that suggested this was not pure praise. The head monk walked slowly through the garden, looking at the bare earth, the precisely raked gravel, the stones standing in their perfect isolation. He paused at a section where moss had grown on a rock, and Toyo had carefully scraped away the excess, leaving only a thin layer that seemed intentionally placed. He paused at another spot where the gravel was so perfectly smooth it looked almost artificial, like an illustration in a book rather than an actual space. "Tell me, Toyo," the head monk said, turning to face him, "why did you remove everything? Why did you make it so clean that nothing lives here anymore?" Toyo was confused. "But master, you told me to remove the weeds, to make the garden pure and perfect for contemplation. I have done exactly as you instructed." The head monk nodded slowly. "Yes, you have done what I said. But did you think about what I meant? Did you consider the purpose of a garden?" "A garden is for contemplation," Toyo replied, still uncertain where this was leading. "It should be orderly and beautiful, a reflection of the harmony we seek in our practice." The head monk walked to the edge of the garden where a single tree grew, its branches extending over part of the gravel expanse. Toyo had carefully removed all the leaves that had fallen beneath it, had pulled up all the seedlings that had sprouted from fallen seeds. The area was clean, bare, lifeless. The head monk stood there looking up at the tree, And then he said something that would stay with Toyo for the rest of his life. "It is beautiful, yes. But where will the butterflies rest?" The words fell into the silence of the afternoon like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through Toyo's understanding. Where will the butterflies rest? He had been so focused on removing imperfection that he had removed life itself. He had been so intent on creating purity that he had created sterility. The garden was clean, orderly, perfect in its way, but it was also dead, or nearly so. Nothing could live in such perfection. Nothing could take root, could grow, could transform. The head monk continued, his voice gentle but carrying a teaching that cut through Toyo's assumptions about practice and perfection. The Buddha taught us to avoid all evil, to cultivate good, and to cleanse our own minds. This is true, but notice what he said: to cultivate good, not to destroy everything that is not perfect. A garden is not meant to be a sterile space. It is meant to be a living space, a place where controlled wildness and intentional order exist together. Some weeds must be removed, yes, or they will overtake everything. But some roughness, some spontaneity, some life. These things are not imperfections to be eliminated. They are part of what makes a garden rather than a picture of a garden. He knelt down and ran his fingers through the gravel where Toyo had made it perfectly smooth. Then he deliberately disturbed it, creating a small irregularity, and he took a few leaves that had fallen from the tree and placed them in the gravel, where they looked both random and somehow right, like punctuation in a long sentence. "This," he said, "is more honest. This acknowledges that we live in the world, not in some idealized space apart from it." Toyo felt something crumbling inside him, some rigid structure of beliefs about what practice meant and what perfection looked like. "But Master," he said, his voice small, "if we do not strive for perfection, if we allow disorder and imperfection to remain, are we not failing in our practice? Are we not giving in to laziness or complacency?" The head monk stood and placed a hand on Toyo's shoulder. "There is a difference," he said, "between the weeds that must be removed and the life that must be honored. A weed that spreads aggressively and chokes out other plants that must be controlled, but a small flower that seeds itself in the garden, a patch of moss that grows naturally on a stone, a few fallen leaves that remind us that time passes and seasons change. These are not problems to be solved. These are teachers. They remind us that our practice is not about creating a perfect dead space. It is about learning to live with what is, to work with reality rather than against it, to find the balance between order and chaos, between control and surrender." Toyo looked at the garden with new eyes, seeing now not his accomplishment but his mistake. He had wanted so badly to do well, to prove his diligence, to create something that would be praised, that he had gone too far. He had applied the teaching mechanically, without wisdom, without considering context or purpose or the deeper meaning behind the instruction. "What should I do now?" he asked. "How do I fix this?" The head monk smiled. "You wait," he said. "You let life return. You trust that seeds will blow in on the wind, that moss will grow back, that the garden will find its own balance if you stop trying to control every aspect of it. Your job is not to create lifeless perfection. Your job is to tend to remove what is truly harmful, while allowing what is beneficial or simply natural to remain. This is harder than what you did today. It requires judgment rather than just effort. It requires wisdom rather than just discipline." Over the following weeks and months, Toyo learned this new way of tending the garden. He still removed weeds, but he learned to distinguish between aggressive, invasive plants that would destroy the garden's balance and small volunteers that added texture and life. He still raked the gravel, but he learned to leave some irregularity, some evidence of wind and rain and the passage of time. He learned to step back, to observe, to work with what was rather than imposing his idea of what should be. And the butterflies did return. They landed on the small flowers that Toyo now allowed to grow in certain areas. They rested on the stones that had moss softening their edges. The garden became more beautiful than it had been in his first attempt at perfection, beautiful because it was alive, because it held the tension between order and wildness, because it reflected the actual world rather than some sterile ideal of what a garden should be. This teaching applies to more than gardens. Think of all the ways you might be trying to create lifeless perfection in your own life, pulling up everything that seems imperfect or out of place, trying to eliminate all roughness and spontaneity and surprise. Perhaps you are trying to perfect your meditation practice, judging every wandering thought as a failure, trying to achieve some idealized state of constant concentration rather than working with the mind you actually have. Perhaps you are trying to perfect your character, harshly criticizing every impulse that seems less than noble, trying to become some impossible ideal rather than accepting and working with your actual human complexity. The Buddha taught to cultivate good and cleanse the mind, but this cleansing is not about destroying everything that seems imperfect. It is about removing what truly harms while allowing space for growth, for change, for the messy process of becoming that characterizes all life. A perfectly clean garden with nothing growing in it is not a garden. It is a graveyard. And a perfectly controlled mind with no space for spontaneity, for surprise, for the small flowers of unexpected joy or the fallen leaves of natural sadness, this is not awakening. This is death dressed up as enlightenment. Let yourself be a garden that has some weeds pulled, but not all, that has some order imposed but not total control, that has space for butterflies to rest and seeds to sprout, and life to express itself in ways you did not plan and cannot fully manage. Your practice is not about achieving sterile perfection. It is about tending what grows, removing what truly harms, and trusting the rest to find its own balance, its own beauty, its own expression of the life that flows through all things and cannot be controlled, only honored. Rest now in the imperfect garden of this moment, with all its messiness and all its beauty, with thoughts that drift like leaves and sensations that come and go like butterflies, with the breath that flows in its own rhythm and the body that holds its own wisdom. You do not need to perfect any of it. You need only to tend it with attention and compassion, removing what truly harms while letting the rest be exactly as it is alive, changing, perfectly imperfect, a garden where life can flourish because there is space for it, because perfection has been traded for presence, because you finally understand that where there is no room for butterflies, there is no room for awakening either. From the garden where butterflies need a place to rest among the perfectly raked stones, we now move to another kind of garden, one where two monks stand arguing while a flag waves in the wind above them. If the previous story taught us about the balance between order and life, this tale invites us to look more carefully at what we think we see, to question whether the movement we observe is really where we think it is, and to consider that the source of everything we experience might be closer than we imagine. The monastery was old and respected, known throughout the region as a place of serious practice and authentic teaching. Monks came from distant provinces to study there, to sit in meditation under the guidance of masters who had themselves sat for decades, who had passed through the gates of understanding and could now help others find those same gates. The monastery had strict rules about silence and decorum, about when to speak and when to remain quiet, about maintaining an atmosphere of contemplative peace that would support the difficult inner work that practice required. On this particular day, a ceremony was taking place in the main courtyard. The abbot was giving a Dharma talk, speaking about the nature of impermanence, about how all conditioned things arise and pass away, about how suffering comes from clinging to what cannot be held. A large crowd had gathered, not just the resident monks, but also lay people from the surrounding villages, merchants and farmers and families who had come to hear the teaching and receive blessings. At the front of the courtyard, mounted on a tall pole, hung a ceremonial flag embroidered with sacred symbols, and it moved in the breeze that swept through the valley, its fabric rippling and snapping with each gust of wind. Toward the back of the crowd stood two young monks who had arrived at the monastery only recently, perhaps a few weeks earlier, both of them still learning the rhythms of monastic life, both eager to demonstrate their understanding of the Dharma. They were watching the flag wave, and one of them, the taller of the two, leaned toward his companion and whispered, breaking the silence that was supposed to be maintained during the Dharma talk. "Look at that flag," he said, his voice low but carrying a tone of certainty. "See how it moves. The flag is moving." The second monk, shorter and broader in build, frowned at this observation. He looked at the flag, then back at his companion, and whispered in reply, "No, you are wrong. The flag is not moving. It is the wind that is moving. The flag is simply responding to the wind's movement. If there were no wind, the flag would hang still. So it is the wind that moves, not the flag." The first monk's face flushed slightly, as young men's faces do when their certainty is challenged. He had spoken what seemed to him an obvious truth, and now this other monk was contradicting him, and worse, doing so with what seemed like superior reasoning. He whispered back, his voice taking on an edge, "You are being too clever. Of course the wind moves, that is obvious, but the flag also moves. We can see it moving. To say the flag does not move is to deny what is right before our eyes. The flag moves." The second monk shook his head, growing frustrated himself now. The flag is an object acted upon by the wind. It has no movement of its own. If the wind stopped, the flag would stop. Therefore the movement belongs to the wind, not to the flag. This is simple logic. The wind moves, the flag does not. Their whispered argument was growing louder, beginning to draw the attention of other monks around them, who turned to look with expressions of disapproval and annoyance. The abbot was still speaking at the front of the courtyard, his words about impermanence and non-attachment flowing out over the crowd, but the two young monks were no longer listening. They were entirely absorbed in their debate, each convinced of his own correctness, each determined to make the other see reason. "It is the flag," the first monk insisted, his whisper now almost a normal speaking voice. "It is the wind," the second monk replied with equal volume and conviction. "The flag moves. The flag does not move. The wind moves. No, it is the flag that moves." Back and forth they went, their argument circling on itself like a dog chasing its tail, each response provoking a further response, neither willing to concede, neither able to convince the other. The monks around them began to shift uncomfortably, and a few looked toward the abbot, hoping he would intervene and restore order, but he continued his talk as if unaware of the disruption at the back of the crowd. Finally, a third figure approached the two arguing monks. He was older than them, perhaps in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that suggested years of outdoor practice and simple living. He wore plain robes without any of the marks that would indicate high rank, and he walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. The two young monks did not notice him at first, so absorbed were they in their dispute. But when he stopped beside them and stood there quietly, they gradually became aware of his presence and fell silent, turning to look at him with expressions that mixed embarrassment at being caught arguing with curiosity about what he might say. The older monk looked at the flag for a moment, watching it wave in the breeze. Then he looked at the two young monks with eyes that held neither judgment nor approval, but something like gentle amusement, the way a grandfather might look at children arguing over which of them drew the better picture. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear, and it carried a quality of authority that had nothing to do with rank or position, but came from some deeper place. "Not the wind," he said, "not the flag. The mind is moving." The two young monks stared at him, their argument forgotten, their certainty suddenly thrown into question. What did he mean? The flag was clearly moving. They could see it. The wind was clearly moving. They could feel it. How could he say that the mind was moving? The mind was not a physical thing that could be seen waving in the breeze. The mind was what was observing the flag and the wind, what was thinking thoughts about movement and stillness. How could the mind be what was moving? The older monk did not wait for them to formulate their questions. He simply turned and walked away, his limp more pronounced than before, disappearing into the crowd that was beginning to disperse as the abbot's talk concluded. The two young monks stood there in confused silence, the heat of their argument cooling, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, curiosity, the uncomfortable feeling that comes when you realize you have been asking the wrong question entirely. Later, they learned that the older monk was the sixth patriarch, a teacher of great realization who was visiting the monastery and who had overheard their argument. They learned that his words were not meant to take sides in their dispute, but to point beyond it entirely, to shift their attention from what they were observing to who was doing the observing, from the objects of experience to the subject having the experience. The Buddha taught that all conditioned things are impermanent, that when one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. But what the sixth patriarch was pointing to was even more subtle. Yes, the flag is impermanent, moves and changes, and will eventually decay. Yes, the wind is impermanent, arises and passes away from moment to moment. But what creates the perception of movement? What divides the continuous flow of experience into separate things called flag and wind? What is it that sees movement at all? The mind takes the seamless flow of reality and cuts it into pieces, names those pieces, creates relationships between them, tells stories about which piece is causing which other piece to move. This process is so automatic, so habitual, that we do not notice we are doing it. We think we are simply observing what is, reporting objectively on the flag moving or the wind moving. But actually, we are participating in creating the experience of movement through the very act of perceiving and conceptualizing and naming. The mind is moving. It is moving as it divides experience into subject and object. It is moving as it creates the category of flag and the category of wind and the concept of movement that connects them. It is moving as it generates opinions about which is really moving and arguments to defend those opinions. All of this activity, all of this movement is happening in the mind, and we mistake it for movement happening out there in the flag or the wind or the world. This is not to say that the world is an illusion or that there is no flag and no wind. It is to say that how we experience the world is shaped fundamentally by the activity of mind, by the categories and concepts and divisions that mind creates. The flag and the wind are not separate things interacting. They are part of one continuous process, one flow of energy and matter and change. It is mind that separates them, that says this is flag and that is wind, that creates the question of which one is moving. And so when the two monks argued about whether the flag moves or the wind moves, they were not arguing about the external world. They were demonstrating the movement of their own minds, the way thought divides and categorizes and creates conflicts where none existed before. Neither of them was wrong exactly, and neither was right. They were both trapped in the movement of conceptual thinking, both missing what was actually present. The simple, direct experience of fabric and air and change, before any story about flag or wind or movement is imposed upon it. The question, what is moving, assumes that things can be neatly separated into movers and moved, into causes and effects, into this and that. But reality does not come pre-divided this way. Reality is continuous, flowing, interconnected. Mind divides it. Mind creates the sense of separate things, and then mind argues about which separate thing is causing which other separate thing to change. All the while, the actual movement. The movement that matters is happening in mind itself, in the constant activity of perceiving and conceiving and believing that creates the world we think we live in. Perhaps you have been in arguments like this, debates about whether it is this or that, whether the cause is here or there, whether the responsibility belongs to one person or another. And perhaps if you look closely at these arguments, you will see that they are often arguments about categories and concepts, about how to name and divide and understand what is happening, rather than about what is actually happening. The mind is moving, creating divisions, taking sides, defending positions, and all of this movement obscures the simple, direct experience that exists before mind begins its dividing and naming work. What would it be like to see the flag and the wind, not as two separate things, but as one process, one flow? What would it be like to observe your own mind creating the division between them, making the distinction, generating the question of which is moving? Not to stop doing this. Mind will continue to categorize and divide as long as we are alive and thinking. But to see it happening, to recognize it as mind's movement rather than as an objective fact about external reality. Let yourself rest now in awareness of mind's movement. Notice how thoughts arise and create categories, how perception divides the continuous flow of experience into separate things with separate names. Notice how the very act of reading these words involves mind moving, creating meaning, following sentences, building understanding. And notice that this movement of mind is not wrong or bad or something to be eliminated. It is simply what mind does. The way a flag moves when wind touches it? The way wind moves when temperature and pressure create gradients? The way all things move because stillness is only an idea, a concept that mind creates and imposes on a reality that is pure flow, pure change, pure process from beginning to end. Not the flag, not the wind, not even the mind as a fixed thing that does the moving, just movement itself, change itself, the ceaseless arising and passing of experience, with no one separate from it observing it, no thing apart from the process doing the processing. This is what the sixth patriarch pointed to with his words, not another better answer to the question of what moves, but the dissolution of the question itself. The recognition that the question assumes divisions that do not exist except in the movement of mind that creates them. Rest in this recognition now, in the space before divisions arise, in the awareness that is present before the flag is called flag, and the wind is called wind, and movement is distinguished from stillness. Rest in the movement that is everything and nothing, that is the flag and the wind and the mind and the watching and the being watched all at once, undivided, continuous, whole, still even in its constant change, silent even in its endless speaking, here now, before any story about here or now or Beth or has been told. From the monastery courtyard where the mind's movement creates the divisions we mistake for reality, we now travel to meet a hermit living in the forest, and a king who comes seeking answers to questions that will not let him rest. If the story of the flag taught us about the mind's role in creating what we perceive, this tale invites us to consider which questions actually matter, which moments deserve our full attention, and what we are looking for when we search for wisdom outside the present moment. The king was not a bad man, but he was a troubled one. He had everything that people imagine would bring happiness: wealth beyond measure, power that extended across vast territories, respect from his subjects, a palace with rooms he had never even entered, gardens that required 100 workers to maintain. But none of this brought him peace. His mind was restless, always seeking, always questioning, always convinced that there was some wisdom he had not yet acquired, some understanding that would finally quiet the constant churning of his thoughts. He had heard of a hermit who lived deep in the forest, a man who had renounced all worldly possessions and ambitions, who had walked away from a comfortable life to live alone in a small hut and contemplate the nature of existence. People said this hermit had achieved a kind of understanding that made him content with nothing, that his eyes held a peace that the king's eyes, for all their authority, did not hold. The king decided he must meet this hermit and ask him the questions that burned in his mind, the questions he believed held the key to his own peace. So the king set out one morning with a small group of guards, and they rode through the forest following directions given by villagers who occasionally saw the hermit when he came out of the woods to beg for food. After several hours of riding, they found a clearing where a simple hut stood, barely more than a shelter against rain, with walls made of woven branches and a roof of layered bark. Near the hut, an old man was digging in a small garden, turning soil with a wooden spade, his movements slow but steady, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. The king dismounted and approached, and the hermit looked up from his work. He was indeed old, perhaps 70 or more, and thin in the way that people who eat little become thin, but his eyes were clear and present. He nodded at the king as he might nod at anyone, showing neither deference to his rank nor hostility to his intrusion. He simply acknowledged the king's presence and returned to his digging. "I have come a long way to find you," the king said, waiting for the hermit to stop working and give him proper attention. "I have questions that need answering, and I have been told that you are a man of great wisdom." The hermit paused in his digging and looked at the king more carefully. He saw a man in middle years, richly dressed but with tension in his face, eyes that moved restlessly, hands that did not know how to be still. "I am just an old man digging a garden," the hermit said. "But you are welcome to sit and rest. You look tired from your journey." The king was not interested in rest. He was interested in answers. He launched immediately into his questions, the ones that had haunted him for years. "Tell me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "what is the most important time? Is it the present moment, as some teachers say? Or is it the future which we can plan for and shape? Or perhaps it is the past, which we must learn from if we are to avoid repeating mistakes? The hermit listened while continuing to dig, turning the soil, preparing it for planting. He did not answer immediately, and the king felt impatience rising in his chest. Had he come all this way to be ignored? And who is the most important person? The king continued. Is it oneself, as some philosophers claim, since we can only truly know our own experience? Is it one's teacher or spiritual guide? Is it one's family, or perhaps it is one's subjects, for a king, since their well-being depends on his decisions? Still the hermit dug, and still he did not answer. The king's guards shifted uncomfortably, hands moving toward their weapons, ready to demand respect for their sovereign. But the king raised his hand to stop them. Something about the hermit's steady work, his complete lack of concern for the king's questions, was beginning to irritate him, but also to intrigue him. And what is the most important thing to do? The king pressed on. Is it to seek enlightenment? To fulfill one's duties? To accumulate merit through good deeds? To govern wisely? To prepare for death? What should occupy my attention above all else? The hermit finally stopped digging. He set down his spade and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt. He was breathing hard from the exertion, clearly tired. Then he looked at the king and said, "You have travelled far and asked your questions. But I am old, and this work is difficult for me. Would you help me dig for a while? These beds must be finished before evening, or the plants I wish to put in tomorrow will have nowhere to go." The king was taken aback. He had not come here to dig gardens. He had come for wisdom, for answers to profound questions. But, looking at the old man's tired face, at the small plot of earth that still needed turning, he found himself agreeing. "Very well," he said, "I will help you dig. But then you must answer my questions." The hermit handed him the spade, and the king removed his outer robe and began to work. He had not done physical labor in years, and within minutes his hands hurt and his back ached. The soil was heavy and filled with roots that had to be loosened and pulled out. The sun beat down and sweat ran into his eyes. But he continued, falling into the rhythm of the work, and gradually his mind, which had been so full of questions and restlessness, began to quiet, to focus simply on the task at hand. Lift the spade, push it into the earth, turn the soil, pull out the roots, move to the next spot. After perhaps an hour of this work, the king heard a sound from the forest path, a crashing and stumbling, and he looked up to see a man running toward them, clutching his side where blood was seeping through his fingers. The man collapsed at the edge of the clearing, gasping for breath, clearly badly wounded. Without thinking, the king dropped the spade and ran to him, kneeling beside him and pressing his hands against the wound to slow the bleeding. "Help me get him inside," he called to his guards, and together they carried the wounded man into the hermit's hut and laid him on the simple sleeping mat. The king, whose hands had signed death warrants and treaties but had never touched blood before, found himself tearing strips from his own fine garments to make bandages, washing the wound with water the hermit brought from a nearby stream, staying with the injured man through the afternoon and into the evening, making sure he continued breathing, giving him water when he could swallow, speaking softly to him when he groaned in pain. The wounded man survived the night. By morning he was conscious enough to speak, and he told his story. He had been a thief, had stolen from a merchant, had been pursued by the merchant's guards and struck down. He had fled into the forest hoping to hide, but his wound had weakened him. He expected to die. He certainly had not expected to find the king himself tending his wounds. The king stayed with him through the day, and the hermit brought food and changed bandages, and by evening of the second day it was clear the man would live. He looked at the king with tears in his eyes. "You saved my life," he said. "I am a thief and you are a king, and yet you treated me as you would treat your own son. I do not understand this kindness. Why did you help me?" The king did not have an answer. He had simply done what the moment required, and in doing it, something in him had shifted, had quieted, had found a kind of rest he had not felt in years. On the third day, the wounded man was well enough to travel, and the king's guards prepared to escort him to the village where he could continue recovering. Before they left, the king turned to the hermit. remembering suddenly the questions he had come to ask. "You never answered me," he said. "What is the most important time? Who is the most important person? What is the most important thing to do?" The hermit smiled, and there was such kindness in that smile that the king felt his chest tighten. "But I have answered you," the hermit said. "I answered you through what happened here these past 3 days. Did you not see?" The king shook his head, not understanding. "The most important time," the hermit said, "is always now. It is the only time we have, the only time we can act. When you were digging with me, that present moment was the most important time. When the wounded man appeared, that present moment became the most important time. There is never any time but now. And the most important person," he continued, "is always the one you are with. When you were digging with me, I was the most important person. When the wounded man appeared, he became the most important person. When you return to your palace and your queen greets you, she will be the most important person. We do not live in abstractions. We live with actual people in actual moments. And the most important thing to do," the hermit finished, "is to do good for the person who is standing before you. When I needed help with the garden, the most important thing was to help me dig. When the wounded man needed care, the most important thing was to care for him. The most important thing is always the thing that this moment, this person, this situation requires." The king felt something settle in him, some question that had been asked and re-asked for years, finally receiving an answer, simple enough and true enough to quiet the asking. He had come seeking profound wisdom about past and future, about abstract principles and cosmic truths. What he had found was something more immediate, more practical, more completely available. The wisdom of attending fully to what is actually here, to who is actually present, to what actually needs doing. He bowed deeply to the hermit, and the gesture was not the formal bow of a king to a subject, but the genuine bow of a student to a teacher, of someone who has received something precious and knows it. Then he mounted his horse and rode back toward his palace. But he was not the same man who had ridden out 3 days before. That man had been seeking something he thought he lacked, some wisdom outside himself that would finally bring peace. This man understood that peace was not found by asking the right questions, but by giving the right attention not to the imagined or the abstract or the distant, but to what was here, now, asking for his presence. The Buddha taught that a wise person should be urgently moved on occasions that make for urgency. The wounded man was urgent. The old hermit's weariness was urgent. These required response, required presence, required the king to set aside his questions about ultimate truth and attend to the immediate truth of suffering and need right before him. And in that attending, he found what he had been seeking not as a concept to be grasped, but as an experience to be lived. Perhaps you too have been asking questions about the most important time, the most important person, the most important thing. Perhaps you have been searching for answers in books and teachings and the wisdom of others, convinced that the answer exists somewhere else, somewhere other than here and now. But what if the hermit is right? What if the most important time is this moment right now as you rest here on the edge of sleep? What if the most important person is yourself in this moment, or whoever you will be with when you wake tomorrow? What if the most important thing is simply to be present, to pay attention, to respond to what is actually here, rather than what you imagine should be here, or wish was here, or fear might be here in the future? Let yourself release the searching now, the asking of questions that push the present moment away in favor of some imagined better understanding that will come later. Let yourself be here, now, with this breath, this moment, this simple fact of being alive and aware. The wound that needs tending is the one that is here. The garden that needs digging is the one in front of you. The person who needs your attention is the one you are with. And all of this is available not later, not after you understand more, or become better, or figure everything out, but now, in this moment, that is always the most important moment, because it is the only moment that actually is. Rest in this now, in this presence, in this simple eternal truth that the hermit gave to the king, and the king gives to us, that what we seek is not elsewhere, not in the past. We cannot change, or the future we cannot know, but here, in the present that is always arriving, always new, always offering itself completely, if we will only stop searching long enough to see what is already given. From the hermit's forest, where a king learned that the most important time is always now, we arrive at our final story, a teaching that will gather all the threads we have followed tonight and weave them into something both simple and profound. If the king learned about presence, this tale invites us to consider what reflects and what is reflected, what changes and what remains unchanged, what seems broken and what was never actually whole in the first place. There was a Zen teacher named Dogen who lived in 13th century Japan, though this story could be told of any teacher in any time, because what it points to is timeless, always present, always available, regardless of era or culture or the particular circumstances of our lives. Dogen was known for his profound teachings on the nature of reality and practice, and his words could be both beautifully poetic and maddeningly paradoxical, often in the same sentence. But perhaps his most accessible teaching, the one that required no special knowledge to understand, yet contained depths that could be explored for a lifetime, was his teaching about the moon and water. Imagine, Dogen would say to his students, that you are walking at night and you come to a lake. The moon is full and bright, hanging in the sky like a lantern, and its light reflects perfectly in the still water of the lake. So perfect is this reflection that for a moment you cannot tell which is the real moon and which is the reflection. Two moons appear to exist, one in the sky and one in the water, and both seem equally real, equally present, equally luminous. Now imagine that this lake is vast, stretching to the horizon, its surface containing hundreds of smaller ponds and pools, each one reflecting the same moon. You see the moon reflected in the large lake. You see it reflected in a small pond near the shore. You see it reflected in a puddle no bigger than your hand. Each reflection is complete, not a fraction of the moon or a partial image, but the whole moon appearing fully in each body of water regardless of its size. The students would listen, some nodding, some waiting to hear where this was going, all of them understanding the basic observation but not yet grasping what it was meant to teach them. Now, Dogen would continue, imagine that you throw a stone into one of these pools. The water ripples, the surface breaks and churns, and the moon's reflection shatters into 1,000 fragments of light dancing across the disturbed water. The moon appears broken, destroyed, lost. But then look up at the sky. The moon itself has not moved. The moon itself has not been broken or disturbed. The moon remains exactly as it was, whole and complete and unchanged, while its reflection dances in the troubled water. Wait longer, and the ripples will gradually subside. The water will return to stillness, and when it does, the moon's reflection will reappear, whole and unbroken, exactly as it was before the stone was thrown. Nothing was actually lost. Nothing needed to be repaired or restored. The moon simply reflects again in the still water as naturally and effortlessly as it reflected before. Here, Dogen would say, and his voice would take on a different quality now, no longer describing but pointing, no longer teaching but inviting. Direct seeing here is the nature of your true self, your Buddha nature, your original face before your parents were born. It is like the moon. It shines on all things equally, reflects in all things completely, and is never actually disturbed by the ripples and waves that seem to break its reflection. The large lake is like the mind of a Buddha, spacious and vast, capable of reflecting the moon with perfect clarity. The small pond is like the mind of an ordinary person, more limited perhaps, more bounded by conditions and circumstances, but still capable of reflecting the moon completely. Even the tiny puddle reflects the whole moon, not just a piece of it. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught that all beings have Buddha nature, that awakening is not something to be acquired, but something to be recognized, that you are already complete and whole, regardless of how small or insignificant or troubled you feel. The ripples on the water are like the thoughts and emotions and experiences that move through your life. Something happens. You lose your job. Your relationship ends. Someone you love dies. You make a mistake that haunts you. You feel angry or afraid or ashamed. The water of your mind is disturbed. The reflection seems to break. You look at the shattered light dancing on the surface and you think, I am broken, I am damaged. Something essential has been lost or destroyed. The peace I once had is gone. But look up at the moon. The moon was never broken. The moon never moved. What was broken was only the reflection, only the appearance, only the temporary image on the surface of changing water. Your true nature, your deepest self, the awareness that watches all of this, that was never actually disturbed. It remains whole and complete and luminous, just as it has always been, just as it will always be. The Buddha taught that we should do good again and again, that we should develop this habit, for the accumulation of goodness brings joy. But notice what he said, develop the habit, accumulate goodness. This implies time, process, growth. And this is true at one level. At the level of the reflection, at the level of the rippling water, practice matters. Meditation smooths the water. Ethical conduct prevents new stones from being thrown. Wisdom helps us recognize that we are the moon, not just the reflection. All of this is valuable and necessary. But at another level, deeper and more fundamental, there is nothing to develop, because nothing is lacking. The moon shines whether the water is still or troubled. Your Buddha nature is present, whether you are peaceful or anxious, clear or confused, virtuous or struggling. It is not created by practice. It is revealed by practice, the way stillness reveals what was always reflecting in the water. Dogen would sometimes take his students to a lake at night to see this teaching directly, not just hear about it. They would sit on the shore and watch the moon reflected in the water, and then he would throw a stone and they would watch the reflection shatter and reform. Some students would understand immediately, would see beyond the metaphor to what it pointed toward, would recognize that they had been identifying with the rippling reflection rather than with the moon itself, had been believing that disturbances on the surface meant damage to the depths. Other students would understand intellectually, but not experientially. They would nod and say, yes, I see, the moon represents Buddha nature, and it is unchanging even when the reflection seems disturbed. But they would still feel broken when difficult emotions arose. They would still believe that their peace depended on keeping the water still, on preventing anything from disturbing the surface, on maintaining perfect conditions so that the reflection could remain clear. And Dogen would tell these students, you are still thinking you are the reflection. You are still identifying with the small pool of water rather than with the vast sky and the moon that shines in it. You are still trying to protect something that cannot actually be damaged. The water will be disturbed, this is certain. Stones will be thrown, wind will blow, rain will fall. The surface will ripple and churn, and the reflection will break again and again. This is the nature of water, the nature of life, the nature of existing in a body with a mind that thinks and feels and responds to circumstances. But you are not only the water, you are also the moon. You are also the sky that holds the moon. You are also the awareness that observes both the moon and its reflection, and the water and the ripples, and the breaking and the reforming. And this awareness, this witnessing presence, is never disturbed. It watches the whole play with complete equanimity, neither grasping at stillness nor resisting disturbance, because it knows that both stillness and disturbance happen within it, happen to the reflection but not to what is reflecting. One of Dogen's students once asked him, "But Master, if my true nature is already perfect and complete like the moon, why do I suffer so much? Why does life feel so difficult and painful? Why am I not at peace?" And Dogen replied, "Because you are looking at the water instead of the moon. You are identifying with the reflection instead of with what is being reflected. When the water ripples, you think you are rippling. When the reflection breaks, you think you are breaking. You have forgotten to look up, to see that the moon remains whole, regardless of what happens to its reflection." "How do I look up?" the student asked. "How do I remember that I am the moon?" "By recognizing what is always here," Dogen said. Even when you feel most disturbed, most broken, most lost, there is awareness of that disturbance, that brokenness, that lostness. What is this awareness? Is it disturbed? Is it broken? Or is it simply aware, simply present, simply watching the whole display with the same calm presence that the moon watches the lake? Start there. Start by noticing that you are aware. not trying to change what you are aware of, not trying to still the water or fix the reflection, but simply recognizing that you are the awareness in which all of this is appearing. Thoughts arise, you are aware of them. Emotions surge, you are aware of them. The body feels tension or pain, you are aware of it. And this awareness, this knowing presence, is it ever actually disturbed by what it knows? Or does it remain like the moon, constant and luminous and whole, while its reflection in the water of your personal experience ripples and breaks and reforms moment by moment? The 15 stories we have travelled through tonight are like ripples on water, each one disturbing the surface in its own way, each one breaking the reflection temporarily before stillness returns. The overflowing cup and the carried woman, the thief who received a robe, and the monk who tasted one hand clapping, the raft that must be released, and the mustard seed that could not be found, the poisoned arrow and the strawberry between tigers, the empty boat and the stone becoming Buddha, the Mon, K unmoved by blame, and the garden that needs butterflies, the flag that was not moving, and the king who learned about now, and finally this teaching about the moon and water. All of them point to the same truth from different angles, like fingers pointing at the same moon from different positions on the shore. That truth is simple enough that a child could understand it, yet profound enough that the wisest sages spend lifetimes exploring its implications. You are not what you think you are. You are not the collection of thoughts and feelings and memories and stories that ripple across the surface of awareness. You are not the reflection, however beautiful or broken it may appear. You are the moon that shines on all reflections equally. You are the sky that holds the moon. You are the awareness in which the whole display appears. The water and the moon and the ripples and the stillness and the breaking and the reforming, all of it arising and passing within the vast, spacious presence that you actually are. This presence was never born and will never die. It was not created by your practice and cannot be destroyed by your failures. It does not increase when you meditate or decrease when you forget to meditate. It does not become more pure when you follow the precepts or less pure when you break them. It simply is, has always been, will always be, the moon shining in the darkness, reflecting in 10,000 waters, whole in each reflection, never divided, never diminished, never disturbed, regardless of how troubled the water becomes. Rest now in this understanding, letting the 15 stories dissolve like ripples returning to stillness, letting the words and teachings and parables fade into the silence from which they emerged. You do not need to remember them. You do not need to hold on to them or figure them out or make them mean something. They were only ever fingers pointing at the moon, and now you have seen what they were pointing at, have recognized what you have always been, have come home to the awareness that never left home in the first place. The moon shines on still water. The moon shines on troubled water. The moon shines on water and on stone, and on your face right now as you rest here in the darkness, breathing in and breathing out, being breathed by something larger than your small sense of self, held by something vaster than your temporary fears and hopes, reflecting something eternal in this temporary moment, whole even in your brokenness, home even in your wandering, awake even as you drift into sleep. The moon on water, the water returning to stillness, the stillness that was there all along beneath the ripples, waiting patiently for you to recognize it, to rest in it, to remember that you were never separate from it, that you are it, have always been it, will always be it. This vast luminous awareness in which everything appears and everything passes and everything is held with perfect equanimity, with complete love, with the gentle recognition that nothing real can ever be lost back. Ours, what is real, was never separate, never alone, never anything other than this moon reflecting in water, this water reflecting the moon, this reflection, and what is reflected dancing together in the timeless now, where all stories end and all truth begins. Sleep now in this moonlight, in this reflection, in this stillness that holds all movement, in this awareness that witnesses all experience without being touched by any of it, in this home you never left, in this peace you always were, in this Buddha nature that is your deepest truth, your original face, your eternal presence shining on still water, shining on troubled water, shining always, everywhere, in everything, as everything, forever whole, forever home, forever here.